This is a presentation of the 19th Annual Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop, a program of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, Friends of CAIC, and the National Avalanche Center, presented by Dynafit and Pomoka.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 19th Annual Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop. We're really excited about the program that we're all going to experience over the next couple of days. And I want to thank a few people for how this all kind of came together. First and foremost, our sponsors, Dynafit and Pomoka, and all the other sponsors that have contributed to this event. We're going to hear from Dynafit a little bit each day, so you'll get a little information from them. And then the Forest Service National Avalanche Center. This meeting really started with the pandemic from last spring. We were pretty impressed and inspired with what the Canadian Avalanche Association did with their spring meeting. And Carl Birkeland contacted me, and we talked about how in the fall we were going to have to do something with seesaw that was going to be really different, and we weren't really sure what it was going to be like and what we could do. And so over the course of the summer, Carl, the folks at the Friends of the CAIC, and a bunch of the folks at the CAIC itself worked on this meeting. And I hope that it's going to be really good for all of us. Again, I'm very excited with everybody that's participating and the range of speakers and participants that we've been able to gather for this. Just a little bit of information about you, the attendees. We have over 1,200 people registered at this point from 4 different continents and 14 different countries and 36 of the US states. So a pretty broad group. Yeah, pretty different than what we usually do for Seesaw, which is a live event in Colorado that brings 600 to 700 people together. So hopefully this is one of the good things that comes out of the strange times that we're all experiencing. As Carl and all of us talked about what we wanted to do for this for this meeting, we wanted to try to do something that gave people access to some really good content, some of the best work that's being done around the globe, and also to give people the chance to absorb it at a pace that was right for them, and give them the opportunity to talk to some of these international experts about the things that they're studying and the questions that they're trying to pursue. So what we did was put together the format that you're hopefully have participated in over the last week, which is all of these recorded talks that you can view online. Hopefully you've have gone through a bunch of those already. There's a tremendous amount of content there. It's over 5 hours of content. Really pretty amazing stuff. I really want to give kudos to all of the speakers who put those talks together. It's really kind of an amazing collection. Those are going to be up for the next month, so if you didn't watch them, you still have time, and please take advantage of that. Then today what we're going to do is each speaker is going to put together just a brief summary of their talk, so not the full 7 to 30 minutes of content, but just a couple of minutes to kind of remind you of what they've been talking about. And then we've paired them with 2 moderators that also have a lot of knowledge about the topic. And we're going to try to create a discussion between the 3 of them and really any of you that want to join in. So it's a great opportunity for you to talk with 3 people that are quite knowledgeable, international experts in the topic, and you know, we'll all be able to sort of share that together. So there's 2 ways that you can ask questions. You can raise your hand, and you saw how to do that with the introductory video. Look at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to raise your hand, and we'll unmute your mic, and you can join the conversation. And we really encourage you to take advantage of that. If you don't want to ask a live question, you can type a question into the question answer chat. And we have a group of people here in the war room that will be grabbing those questions and feeding them to the moderator. So you have two choices there. We don't have a way through Zoom for you to talk to each other, but we did want to provide an opportunity for you to do that. So we do have a Facebook event on the Friends of the CAIC Facebook page that will be running over the next 3 days. And that's a chance for all of you to see the other participants and just chat to each other. It's sort of the equivalent of being in the conference and standing in the back of the room and whispering to your neighbor. So we hope that you take advantage of that as well. We're not going to be monitoring that. So if you have a question for us, please look at the Eventbrite email that you got, and you can email us. So if you have a question that's not about the content, that's the way to get a hold of us. Otherwise, just put your questions into the Q&A. We will take the recording of this live event and put it on the same page where the recordings of each talk are. That'll probably happen early next week, and that will be up for a month as well. So it's going to be sort of drinking from the fire hose with all of the content, and you do have some other ways that you can enjoy that over the next month or so. Because this is a virtual event, we are going to try to stick to the schedule pretty closely. So if you do want to chime out or chime back in, you just look at the schedule and you can see when the next session is going to start. Okay, well, I think that's it for me for introductory comments. So we're going to move on to introducing the first session and the first moderators. Our first session is on avalanche release, and it's going to be moderated by Bruce Jameson and Ben Reuter. Bruce Jameson really needs no introduction in our field. He's currently with Snowline Associates. He started avalanche work in around 1980 at the Fernie Ski Area, and was a professor of engineering at the University of Calgary from 1997 to 2015, where he's really had a huge impact on our field. He managed field studies on snow and avalanches, and spent a lot of time sliding on the snow and occasionally riding around on two-wheelers on dirt trails doing summer field work. He's now an avalanche educator and consultant. And one of the things that I think is really amazing about Bruce's career, notwithstanding everything that he's done over the years, but what he's doing in retirement is putting out an incredible set of videos where he's reached out to other people in our field and collaborated with them on specific topics. And I would highly encourage you to look at those if you haven't. They're pretty amazing. Ben Reuter is our other moderator. Ben's a researcher and an active practitioner. He spent the last few years at the SLF in Davos, and he's also been at Montana State University, collaborating with some of the scientists there. He's currently at Météo France, doing some work on climate impacts and avalanches. So Ben's a really bright star in our field these days as an active researcher and also a mountain guide and trainer. He's doing some pretty interesting work. So I'm very excited to have these guys be part of this session, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Thanks for the introduction and for leading the effort behind this remarkable workshop. I'll be introducing the presenters. After each presenter presents a mini summary of their research, Ben Reuter will be managing the questions and answers. This workshop has been planned to make the most of the discussions, so please ask questions by using the hands up button or by typing a question into the Q&A box. Our first speaker is Bastian Bergfeldt. Bastian studied physics and has been at the Swiss Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research since 2015. Currently, he's doing his dissertation and is working on dynamic fracture propagation in dry snow slab avalanches. His research interests include everything that can be studied experimentally and is related to snow and avalanches. You've all seen Bastian's presentation video about crack propagation speeds at scales from 1 meter to over 400 meters. Before our discussion, Bastian will summarize his results in a couple of minutes. Over to you, Bastian.
Good morning to the US. Good afternoon to Europe. First of all, thanks for the organizers for all their work. Thanks, Carl, for the invitation. The title of our study is Measuring Slope Scale Crack Propagation in Weak Snowpack Layers. A long and maybe boring title, but the study isn't. And the modern picture of the avalanche release process, a very local failure in the weak layer grows maybe, and at a certain point it is big enough for the onset of crack propagation. And at this point, the crack propagates in the weak layer by itself. And this is at a scale at around typically 1 meter or less than a meter. And then this self-propagating crack can travel across the whole slope, so more than hundreds of meters. And this is captured with a dynamic crack propagation, and then afterwards the slab is released and slides down. So when we talk about crack propagation, or in research, we use a propagation saw test to investigate this crack propagation. Propagation saw test, 30 centimeters wide, couple of meters long, isolated snow column. We cut into the saw with a saw into the weak layer, and this test we filmed with a high-speed camera, and we filmed this sidewall, which is speckled with black ink, and then afterwards we can analyze this movie, which image correlation. So, but you see, this is a couple of meters long, but an avalanche is hundreds of meters. So the question is, if the propagation saw test is really a good research tool to investigate crack propagation, because crack propagation, it's more than hundreds of meters. And we tried to measure these crack propagation speeds at all scales relevant for slab avalanche release. And we did that by using the PST setup. So we get very detailed crack speed information at the first couple of meters. And then 1 hour later, we triggered a WUMP, which is basically the same as an avalanche, but without the sliding down after crack propagation. And the WUMP was the crack traveled around 20 meters. And the largest scale we then covered by analyzing a movie of a bombed avalanche. This bombed avalanche was at the same time as we performed the PST and the WUMP. So let's go to the results. To show you the blue background is crack speed data from the propagation saw test, orange from the WUMP, and the green from the avalanche. And this is crack speed with propagation distance on a logarithmic scale. And just to give you to know two things, so we measured crack propagation speeds between 20 and 60 meters per second, and a clear trend with propagation distance was not observable. And so we think this suggests that the propagation saw test is also representative what happens on a larger scale. Yeah, I'm really looking forward for the discussion, and thanks for listening. Thanks for watching the video.
Well, thank you, Bastian, for wrapping up your presentation. I think it's very worthwhile to try and connect the scales between the propagation saw test and the avalanches, because there is a big gap, and you did a great job there, and you had a very nice graph that shows us that we can actually extrapolate or even use these measures we get from the PST. If I pick up what people said about or what questions people asked on your research, they all want to know what we learned for the field from your research. Can you give people an idea what they should look at in the field? How can they estimate how long a crack will run?
Yeah, I think there are two things or two aspects. I think mostly the crack propagation distance is limited by spatial variability. So yeah, trees, whatever, so spatial variability. But on the other hand, it is also possible that cracks tend to arrest at some point, and some cracks are maybe more stable. And for this, we try to measure some characteristics of this crack propagation. And then in further step, we try to link them to the sustainability of this crack propagation. So are higher crack speeds tend to propagate longer, or are these the lower crack speeds? So yeah, the crack propagation itself can also tend to propagate longer or arrest at one point.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. So I think we need to figure out indicators for the crack speed in the future. There is a question from Jonas coming in. He is asking, do you expect different propagation speeds for different densities of the snowpack? So that actually goes right in this direction, Basti. And he also wants to know if you have done any testing in this regard.
I first tried to answer it from the theoretical point of view. So there are not a lot of models representing the crack propagation phase, so the dynamic phase. We have the solitary wave model from Hiley, and he has a formula for crack speed, and there crack speed is proportional to the inverse of density. But the elastic modulus, it is also in proportion, it also goes with the elastic modulus. And so the inverse relationship to density looks like, okay, for lower densities, we have higher crack speeds. But actually the elastic modulus also is very related to the density. And therefore, I suggested higher densities have also higher crack speeds. So that's just the formula. And like with this data set, this study is not able to draw conclusions how speed goes with density. But from a PST data set, like 150 PSTs analyzed with particle tracking, it looks that it is somehow related to density, but just for lower densities, like below 200 kilograms per cubic meter, it looks like that the crack speed is increasing with density. For higher densities, it's a little bit scattered. So it's somewhat related, but not clearly.
Okay, so I guess density has like two influences, and it's on the crack speed in the end, and also the spatial variability in the field will actually determine how far a crack runs. I get you right there, no?
Yeah, I think so. No, the question with the crack speed. So how is crack speed related to density? There it is that it looks like that higher densities have higher crack speeds. With the crack propagation distance, we are not yet sure how crack propagation distance is related to crack speed. I think in the next presentation, Alec will give a few words on that, or he will show the data available in literature and what he did.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask Alec for more then. There's another question of Alan. He says, when there is a release, can I assume that 400 meters is a safe distance?
Depends. No, and there is a slab avalanche release, and he is 400 meters away. And the question is if he's safe. Is that the question?
Yeah, so I think the question is really about how far cracks can run. And you had data for certain distances, but maybe you can tell us from your experience or from your data how far were the cracks that you observed, or how far can cracks run?
Okay, I think the movie I showed in the presentation, in the recorded one, with the 400 meters, I mean, you see the video, it's a very, very large avalanche, which traveled 400 meters cross slope, or mostly cross slope. I think we can not always expect such big avalanches. 400 meters, I would say, is a safe distance that I that I trigger it from the point I am standing, and then the crack travels 400 meters, releases an avalanche, and then it comes back to me. So it's hard to imagine for me.
Okay. In your studies, Basti, you looked at crack speeds in propagation saw tests, and there is a question on those speeds, and they would like to know whether downslope and upslope, you've seen any differences. Did you do PSTs in horizontal and upslope directions, or do you have an idea?
Yeah, long-standing question. Huh? We tried last winter to do such PSTs. I mean, it's always the difference that we measure in the field, and then we measure in the slope and on the flat, and we measure maybe different crack speeds, but the snowpack was different as well. So a setup is needed where we have exactly the same snowpack, same slab, same weak layer, but a tilted one and a flat one. And we experimented this winter to get such measurements. Yeah, we tried hard. We had the setup ready, but the snowpack wasn't good with us. So we didn't get the data this winter, but hopefully next winter. I just one quick addition. We had a look on in the avalanche movie, because there we had we used the distance from the bombing to an opening crack, and there we have an upslope, downslope direction, as well as the cross slope directions. And from the avalanche movie, we didn't see differences. But yeah, this is also not that good quality data that yeah, PST experiments would be better.
To make this a little bit more of a discussion, if I can chime in on this last question about how far avalanches can propagate, under the right conditions and right snowpack and terrain, they can certainly propagate for kilometers. And when we're seeing such extreme propagations, then there's usually pretty clear in the bulletin.
Yeah, I see here in the activity that Michael Conlon has a live question. Can we hear Michael?
Yeah, is this working?
Yeah, I hear you, Michael. Welcome.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Bastian, excellent work. Very, very interesting. I see in your presentation, it looks like your PSTs were 1 to 5 meters long. I'm just wondering on what made you decide on the length of the PST, and if you have any or thoughts on our current guidelines for our PST lengths, and what length we should be using for obtaining relevant data. Is our current guideline of a 1 meter length for a weak layer, a meter deep or less, good enough to pull out relevant information?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I said 1 to 5 meters. Yeah, that's right. And as you already said, it depends on the thickness of the slab. But in any case, yeah, most slabs are 30 centimeters and thicker, and therefore 1 meter, I think, is too short. Not the PST I showed here, but we have, yeah, we did a lot of long PSTs, like 10-meter long slab 2 winters ago, and there we saw that we have edge effects at the beginning, like from the sawing, and edge effects from the far end of the beam, and they reach into the beam like 2 or 3 meters. So if we would really want to learn something about crack propagation, we need at least 5, 6 or longer meter long PSTs as a stability test. I would say, yeah, I mean, we can't dig 8 meter long PSTs as a stability test. So therefore, maybe a little bit longer would be better. 1 meter is rather short, I think, but yeah, it's on the safe side, I would say. Like if we would have observed a crack arrest after 3 meters, the 1 meter 20 would show propagation till the end. But yeah, so the short ones would say unstable, when the long ones maybe show crack arrest. So it's on the safe side, but as a research tool or to learn something about crack propagation, they need to be longer, I think.
So when you talk about those lengths of PSTs, you mentioned the critical crack length, but also I think the depth of the weak layer is an important part, no?
The thickness of the slab, yeah, or the depth of the weak layer.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, so I think the depth of the weak layer should be considerably shorter than the length of the beam, and I think the length of the beam should at least be, Basti, correct me, 3 times the crack length, or even more, no?
It completely depends on the stiffness of the slab. I think to really have, or to really observe this stable crack propagation, which can run very, very far, we need to observe in the PST that the crack tip is not at the far end of the beam, and the trailing point where the slab touches the substratum or the broken weak layer needs to be within the PST as well. And these called touchdown distances are 2 to 4 meters we measured. And so if this is the phenomenon, if this is the process for stable crack propagation, then the PSTs should be that long, at least that long.
Okay, thank you, Basti. There is another live question that Spencer Logan would like to ask. Can we get Spencer?
Yeah. Thanks, Basti. Kind of returning to your point about spatial variability possibly being the most important for crack propagation, do you think some of the differences that we're seeing in speeds, particularly with avalanche scale releases, are due to the cross slope or up and down slope variability?
To be honest, I don't know. I repeat your question to be sure that I got it right. You ask if the cross slope or the upslope crack propagation speed, if we see variability there, if I think it comes from spatial variability, or if spatial variability can explain it. I think the differences we observed with this in our data set, the differences between upslope and cross slope are very small, and this can be easily explained with spatial variability. But if there is maybe really a change in crack propagation mode and the crack speed jumps to a much higher value, then this is maybe not easily explainable with, or cannot easily attribute it to a spatial variability. I mean, yeah, we try to make these measurements in homogeneous snowpacks, but yeah, as you know, it's not possible.
So there may be a critical speed that kind of overwhelms any of the slope scale variability, and we see these really long propagation distances.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, you mentioned that propagation speeds may pass a threshold where the spatial variability is no longer important.
No. I think spatial variability is always important, but yeah, I mean, spatial variability can kill the crack propagation if the slab weak layer system turns into unstable. Then the crack arrests. My point was that there's always the question if crack speeds up or cross slope, if there are crack speed differences. And yeah, we see differences, but as long as the differences are small, we can attribute them to spatial variability. But when these differences are big, then we should, or then maybe the crack propagation process changed.
Okay, great, thank you.
Which is also possible for upslope and crossslope.
Yes.
Thanks, Spencer, for your question. There is another question coming in from Mark Staples. Can we get Mark on the mic?
Hi, Bastian, can you hear me?
I can hear you, thanks. Hi, Mark.
Hi, I'm kind of wondering, when you personally, it's hard, I find for myself, it's hard when I'm not working and I'm not studying something and I head out for a day just to like go have fun and ski or snowboard or whatever. Like all this stuff, which is really cool, like you don't stop thinking about it. And half the time it just makes me really scared. But sometimes these things change the way I just look at, it's hard to really put my finger on what it changes that I do, but I'm just wondering, when you are out, like this winter, when you're gonna be out in the mountains and you're not actively doing research, but you're thinking about all this research you're doing, like what goes through your mind, and how does that maybe change what you do or how you travel?
Depends with whom I'm traveling, in which mood I am. Yeah, it's hard to stop thinking while having fun. That's true. But I think I don't behave much different between traveling while working in the field or traveling with my friends or with my wife. I hope so, but I can't guarantee that it isn't different.
Okay, thanks for this one. There's another question here, I think, that goes a bit into the direction of the contribution of gravity on the crack speeds, and I wanna bring this question in here. It's from Frank Caros, and he asks, is the propagation speed of a crack during an avalanche event fixed and dependent on slab stiffness, or does the speed change during the avalanche? In other words, is there acceleration due to gravity?
Whoa. I hope I could read it as well. If the speed changes.
So it's about the correlation between the density, snow cover properties, and speed.
Mm-hmm. Let's assume we have, or this is my point of view, if we have a stable crack propagation, then it is somehow self-similar. It's like the cracks, if the slab is exactly the same and the weak layer is exactly the same after 1 meter or 100 meters of crack propagation, then we would measure the same crack propagation speed after a certain point, I think. But as soon as we always have little changes in the snowpack and the weak layer, I think also the crack propagation characteristics, such that speed has to will adapt all the time. So yeah, softer slabs, the slab becomes softer, the speed decreases a little bit, the touchdown distance decreases as well. If it gets stiffer and thicker, then it increases. But yeah, so I think crack speed adapts to the snowpack it is experienced it is experiencing at this point. And yeah, so that changes while traveling hundreds of meters.
Okay. Well, thanks, Basti, for these explanations and answering all these questions. To wrap it up, I think the crack speed is an important criterion for the process of dynamic crack propagation, which is one of the parts later on in the avalanche release process. And snow cover properties, they will influence the crack speeds, and they will lately determine how far a crack can run, and the spatial variability that comes into play when these cracks spread are not negligible. So it remains a very interesting field to study, and we will have some more on this topic with our next speaker, and I hand over to Bruce.
Good. Thanks, Ben, and thanks very much to Bastian and all the people who asked questions. That's exactly what this workshop is all about, is this discussion, and it's good to see it off to such a great start. So our next speaker is Alec van Herwijnen, and Alec leads the Avalanche Formation Research Group at the Swiss Avalanche Research Institute in Davos. He has researched avalanche formation in Canada, Switzerland, Montana, and is now back in Switzerland. Following Bastian's presentation on crack propagation speeds, Alec will speak about measurements of crack speeds and propagation distances in WUMFs. Before our discussion, Alex is going to summarize his results in a couple of minutes. Over to you, Alec.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruce, for the introduction. Very nice to see that you're still struggling with my name. So yeah, it's great to be here today. I apologize already. I'm not at home. My internet connection is not all that stable, so I might freeze every now and then. If I do, it's very likely that it will happen if you just ask me a difficult question, but that's okay. So to summarize, yeah, I hope you all looked at my video. We were hunting WUMFs last winter. We means me, Basti, Yannick, and Carl. It's a very fun activity to do. It can be a little bit frustrating now and then, but really the question is why are we doing this? Essentially, like Basti said already, WUMFs are like avalanches. You have all the processes. You have crack initiation, propagation, but you don't have the sliding. So it's a safe way to study avalanches. And this key question that was already very present in all these questions is crack propagation indicative of avalanche size? Because it's something we can measure in a PST relatively easily. And does it give us information about potential avalanche size? So we had this very interesting day on the 31st of January where we were triggering WUMFs all over the place in a creek, essentially. We were walking around this creek all day long, trying to trigger WUMFs on these little snow islands in the middle of the creek where we had a nice layer of surface water. And to measure the crack propagation speed, we had these little accelerometer boxes we had made at the SLF, which we throw on the snow surface. We try to trigger a WUMF, and then as the weak layer collapses, we can measure the acceleration of the snow surface, and then afterwards we measure the location of these boxes, the distances. We have good timing of all these signals, and then we can derive crack speeds. And yeah, the main result is essentially this one graph with 4 data points, which took 20 years to collect, where we have crack speed and propagation distance. The dot in the lower left corner are the WUMFs on the 31st of January, where we had fairly small propagation distances and fairly low propagation speed. And the dots on the upper right-hand corner were where the blue dot is from an avalanche measured with seismic sensors on a steep slope, and the yellow dot was the WUMF that Basti just talked about. So from these 4 data points, it is very obvious that crack propagation is very indicative of propagation distance. There's big error bars, so I wouldn't go that far, but it does give an indication that if the crack propagates faster, then we might perhaps expect bigger avalanches. So to sum up, yeah, we had these 8 measurements, 7 WUMFs and a small avalanche where we measured propagation speeds between 8 and 23 meters per second. And if we put these measurements together with measurements from others, it seems that propagation speed relates to propagation distance. That's essentially what we looked at in a nutshell. There we go.
Thank you, Alec. Very interesting work as well. And I also really liked in your video how you presented also the idea, how the idea developed. And yeah, sometimes you just got to wait until the time is ripe and until you have the right instrumentation to do the studies you would like to do. The questions that we got from the audience, they are sometimes on these 4 data points, and people wonder, couldn't we use other studies or couldn't we use other data and also graph it in this graph? So one question is here, in this comparison of different research on the topic, you didn't include the work you performed in 2005 and the work of Dave Hamry in 2014. Couldn't we use these videos too for the measurements and to complete the data?
Yeah, I lost you a little bit, but that's okay. Yeah, I think that the main question is why did I only use those 4 data points, right? And not videos and other measurements. Yeah, I really wanted to just use direct measurements where we're sure we're measuring weak layer collapse or yeah, where it's directly in the snowpack. Those videos are essentially indirect measurements. We're seeing the tensile crack opening up, and as we'll see, or as you might have seen on the work that Ron has done with enhancing the videos, it might be a lower bound of crack propagation speeds. So I really only wanted to include those where we have direct measurements, and oftentimes you don't have good snowpack information necessarily from those videos either, although I didn't look at it specifically in this case. But yeah, the goal is also to link snowpack properties to speed, of course, in the long run.
Yeah, and this is exactly driving at what we discussed already with Basti, that in the end we want to know which snowpack properties are indicative of crack speed and how far avalanches run. Mm-hmm. Jonas had a good comment, and maybe this is a good idea for you for further research. He says, has anyone distributed the accelerometers with drones already? This might allow safe distribution even on high angle slopes. What do you think about it?
No, it's a good idea. We've discussed this too. The problem, well, the main advantage with doing this on WUMFs is that nothing moves afterwards. So you trigger the WUMF, and then you can measure the position of your boxes, because you really need an accurate position of your boxes. If you do this on a slope, well, everything's going to slide down, so you won't have an accurate position. We have a GPS in those boxes. Yeah, we have a little GPS in the boxes, but this is essentially for time synchronization, and the position is not very accurate. So it would be a bit trickier on a slope for sure. And another thing, I mean, I think the idea is fantastic, and we also want to do it on small slopes and try to do ski cuts, but tiny slopes. We try to come home during at night. But yeah, another practical problem is just that usually it doesn't work, right? So if we were trying to trigger WUMPs, you're just walking around all day long and nothing happens, and maybe you trigger one WUMP. And if you do this on a slope with avalanches, if you don't trigger an avalanche, then you still need to go back on the slope and get your boxes back. So I don't know if you'd be confident to do it.
Okay, so that's a good idea, but it's not that easy. I see there are some things that we easily forget, practical reasons. Sarah would like to know what the accuracy is of the georeferencing for those cracks in the videos.
This was in Basti's talk. I don't know. I think it's okay. It's not that bad. I would say it's on the order of 5 meters, something like this. So on a distance of 400 meters, this is it's like 1%. So it's not too bad.
Okay. And Steve is interested in how far, cracks ran. This is a similar question we had for Basti earlier. And he asks, can anybody speak about historical records of WUMPing in the far north? I heard at one time that there were some incredible distances and speeds recorded in the Arctic. Maybe you cannot speak about the Arctic, Alec, but did you have some incredible in events in Davos when you were out in the field doing your measurements?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's especially one winter in 2017 where we had an incredibly poor snowpack with a very weak base of depth hoar. We were getting very big WUMPs. And this was actually on the first day we tested these accelerometers. We were still mucking around with figuring out how they worked, and we were trying to throw them out in the field. And 2 other colleagues had walking away from us to a weather station about 500 meters away. And by the time we had thrown out the first box, they WUMPed it, and it just made it all the way back to us. So they essentially WUMPed an entire ball, which was 600-700 meters. But there are some older records about the Arctic, what they call snowquakes, and where they have these snowquakes. It's essentially WUMPs also, because in the summer months they can have big depth hoar develop on the snow surface in the Arctic because they have huge temperature gradients. And if it then gets covered by snow and wind-blown snow, you can get a fairly stiff slab with a well-developed depth hoar layer, and they can have these snowquakes travel tens of kilometers. I don't know about the speeds. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, I would imagine they're pretty high too.
Okay, so talking about these speeds and an avalanche size, let's say, I mean, we expect a relation between these two properties, the speed and the size of the avalanche in the end. What do you think could be indicators of avalanche speed, like from a practitioner's point of view? Do you think the density could be a good property, or should we rather look at the hardness of the layer or the depth of the slab? What properties do you think could be indicative?
Well, it's essentially an elastic wave, right? Where there's a wave propagation, and it's propagating through the slab. So I think that the first order, the most important properties are the slab properties. That doesn't mean that weak layer properties are not important, because it consumes energy, right? The weak layer, you need to provide energy to break the weak layer, and I think it might slow it down. But I think, yeah, the most important properties are obviously the slab. And then it's the elastic modulus, which relates to density and hardness, obviously. But in fairness, I think we're all talking about these crack propagation and crack speeds, but I think it's in the end, oftentimes it's going to be spatial variability limiting the avalanche size. So from a practical point of view, maybe also think about spatial variability and not focus too much on crack speed.
Okay, thank you for this one. Yeah, there are many ingredients, huh? Yeah, there's another question here from the audience. I think this you already answered that partly. They are asking, yeah, what the role of the weak layer is, and you just mentioned that it consumes energy. Maybe you can bring up this picture again. Where does the energy come from, and where does the energy go to in this process?
Yeah, so you have, during crack propagation, you have deformation of the slab, which releases gravitational potential energy, essentially, which is then consumed to break the weak layer. So you need to advance the crack, which runs through the weak layer. This costs energy, and the energy comes from the deformation of the slab. And I think, yeah, so as the crack is propagating, the speed is sort of given by the slab. But I think if the weak layer is very resistive to crack propagation, it will surely slow down the propagation. And at some point, in an extreme case, if there is no more propagation, because the weak layer is too hard, it's too difficult to propagate it, it will bring the speed to zero, right? So yeah, I think weak layer, I think it's just a matter of where in the life cycle of a weak layer we are, right? I don't think that crystal type will be incredibly important. I think it's mostly, yeah, is it a fresh weak layer, so to say, that allows for propagation, or is it already an older weak layer that requires much more energy to propagate?
Yeah, thanks, Alec, for illustrating this picture again. This is very nice. There is a live question from Sam Verplank. Maybe we can get Sam on the mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Great work, Alec. Really interesting. In the graphs you showed of the slab acceleration, the acceleration goes negative and then it bounces positive before going to zero. It's these waves. What is that positive acceleration? Is there some sort of bouncing, or do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you cut out halfway through, but yeah. So the acceleration is negative initially and then positive, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's negative because essentially an accelerometer it's a reaction to what happens, right? So if it's moving this way, it will measure an acceleration in the other way. So that's why it's initially negative. It's reacting to what's happening beneath it, and it's yeah, it's actually a very nice waveform where it's initially accelerating because everything is set in motion, and then it's decelerating as the slab has finished crushing the weak layer and you're touching the base. So that's why it's negative and then positive.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's always a bit confusing with accelerometers.
Okay, thanks for answering this question, Alec. Yeah, it's time to wrap up here. And yeah, Alec looked with his team into the question how crack propagation speed may be linked to avalanche size. And so far they only have 4 data points. They try to hunt more bumps to get more information. And if you ask Alec what are the important drivers for sustained crack propagation, first order, he says the slab properties. Second order, he says the weak layer properties. And don't forget about the variability, which might kill or support everything. And with this, I hand back to Bruce, who is introducing our next speaker. Thank you, Alec.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Alec. That discussion once again worked really well. Our next presenter is Carl Birkeland. Carl's been working with the snow avalanche field for 40 years as a ski patroller, backcountry avalanche forecaster, avalanche researcher, and program director. The research he is talking about today was conducted while he was a visiting fellow at the Swiss Federal Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research last winter, which got cut short by the pandemic. Bastian and Alec have talked about crack propagation speeds after a weak layer failure reaches a critical length. In Carl's presentation video, he explains how critical cut lengths change in the hours and minutes after loading. Before we get into our discussion, Carl's going to summarize his results in a couple of minutes. Over to you, Carl.
Thanks, Bruce. And thank you for everyone for organizing this workshop. It's been really interesting so far, and I'm excited to take part. So the work that we did, and again, I did this work with the previous two speakers, with Basti and Alec, is we looked at changes in the critical cut length of propagation saw tests in the minutes and hours following loading. And this built on some previous work that we had done also with Ben. So what we did is we worked on top of this bunker that you see behind me, and we took a sieve and we sieved snow into a cardboard frame, a frame made out of cardboard and duct tape, to add additional load to an existing weak layer. So you saw a little bit more detail about this in the recorded presentation, but we used a sieve. We sieved out a 10 centimeter slab on top of the snowpack. And then what we did was Basti would take ink and put it on the side of the propagation saw test, and these were 1.2 meters, so 120 centimeters. And then we would go ahead and conduct the propagation saw test at time frames varying from 4 minutes after we loaded the snowpack out till about 7 hours, 7.5 hours. And so this is what our results look like. Here on the y-axis, we have the critical cut length. On the x-axis, we have the time after loading. And so you can see that our critical cut lengths here started out very low on the order of 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters. Then by the time we're out here at about 7.5 hours, our cut lengths are 9 centimeters. And so we've seen this increase over time. And that was largely due to stiffening of the upper layer. We didn't get to measure, we don't have measurements of changes within the weak layer, and there were some questions about that I can answer in the question and answer session. But that's a summary of our work, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, for wrapping up your presentation here. Very interesting study, and it's great you continue on this on this field. If I look at the questions of the audience, there is we can maybe start with a question from Sarah. She was wondering how the weak layer characteristics come into play at the onset of crack propagation, and she refers to the equation you showed in your presentation. And she would like to know what role the weak layer plays and what properties are important.
So the you know, that relationship that I showed in the video, the the critical crack length is directly proportional to what's called the weak layer specific fracture energy. And that's the energy required to, for a crack to propagate over a given distance in the weak layer. So it relates back to those weak layer properties. So with a, if the weak layer is stronger, we would expect a longer critical crack length. So really in some of this work where we're looking at changes over time, we would expect that there's a couple things going on. One is the slab is stiffening. The stiffer slab, we would expect longer cut lengths. The other is that the weak layer is strengthening, and as the weak layer strengthens, we'd expect longer cut lengths. And some of this, you know, and then you come back to, well, which one of these two is more dominant? And you know, for this particular work, since we're just looking at we're just looking over a course of 7.5 hours, we might assume that most of the changes occurring are actually changes in the slab, because we're seeing rapid stiffening of the slab. However, in some of the work that we did before, that Ben was working on with us, Ben did some modeling, and in the modeling, you really had to, you know, as you'll recall, Ben, you really had to take into account both the slab stiffening and the weak layer strengthening to really accurately reproduce some of our field measurements. So there's definitely a balance going on there, and we're not 100% sure how that balance works. We think that over our measurements over these shorter time frames, it's probably more changes going on in the slab.
Okay, thank you, Carl. There's a question here from Ian Mahaffey, and he's interested in what happens after these 7.5 hours. What do you think will happen with the balance between slab and weak layer properties? Do you have an idea what might be important in the next hours then?
Yeah, so in the previous work that we did with Ben, we actually looked over a course of 4 days. And again, we saw that there in that work, we didn't have snow micropen measurements. So we just had hand hardness measurements of the slab. And so we couldn't measure really much in the way of changes of the stiffness of the slab after that first day. It seemed like it was a little stiffer, but it was hard to tell. And but when we did the modeling work that Ben was involved in, it really took both that strengthening of the weak layer and the stiffening of the slab. And you know, Mike Conlon and Bruce Jameson did some work looking at changes in I believe it was the shear strength of weak layers after load got added to them. And we actually used some of those relationships to parameterize the model that Ben developed to show some of these changes in the weak layer. So we would expect changes in the weak layer. I mean, when we add a load, especially if we have layers of surface horror, some previous work has shown that as we add a load, those layers of surface horror, the upper and lower layers of snow tend to start to penetrate those layers, and that'll help increase the strength of that weak layer. But we don't have, you know, perfect measures of that. A rather interesting piece of data that Basti actually shared with me is the year before I was at SLF working with them, they had a situation where they had a weak layer surface horror that was very similar to the one we worked with. And they put quite a large, they actually naturally added a fair bit of load to that. And then they did micro CT measurements of that layer of surface horror over the course of a month. So they had 4 different times where they did those micro CT measurements. And that showed that there wasn't a whole lot of change in that weak layer. There was some change, but not a whole lot of change. So I think it's really an open question of how much change is going on in these two properties to drive the actual increase in stabilization that we observe.
Yeah, I also think, yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done and to understand those structural changes. There's a live question from Zach. Maybe we can get him on the mic.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hey, Carl, how's it going?
good.
So I think you started to touch on this with your last little discussion there, but were there any changes in the ambient air temperature during your experiment? And along those lines, do you think there is any influence of ambient air temperature change or friction from the sieving process of the new snow on the slab weak layer interface that could impact those critical cut lengths?
Okay, so as far as the changes in the air temperature, we were in the shade all day that day. I believe we took some air temperatures during the day, but I can't remember. You know, I don't think they changed. If they changed, they didn't change much. You know, because it was December, we were in the shade all day, and the temperatures were rather cold.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, let's see, the second part of your question was, will you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so is there any friction from sieving the new snow that adds possibly heat as it's lowered onto that weak layer? And would that potentially impact critical cut lengths as compared to like a natural deposition process?
So the weak layer, yeah, that's a good question. So the weak layer that we were testing actually had already been buried,
Mm-hmm.
but it had been buried by a very, very thin layer of snow. So the sieve snow that was put on top of that was not actually just sieve snow straight on top of the surface ore. There was actually a very thin layer of snow above that.
Cool.
As far as any friction affecting the way that's sintered, I don't really know for sure. I think the main thing is that as you're putting it through the sieve, you're disaggregating all that snow into the individual grains. Then when they fall onto the snowpack, they pack in much more tightly. So our densities were higher than the original snow. Our densities
Mm-hmm.
were about 300 kilograms per cubic meter, and I believe the densities of those layers, I'd have to go back and look at the pit, but I think they were in the low 200s, something like that. And then because there's more contact points between all those grains that are deposited, they tend to sinter up fairly quickly.
Cool, thank you.
You bet.
Thanks for that question. There's another one from Ron. Maybe we can hear him.
Hey, Carl. Thanks for presenting this cool work. My question is going to spin back to crack propagation and fracture speed. And I wonder if you notice any changes in crack propagation as far as, does it make it all the way to the end of the block? And if you have any idea what was the fracture speed, did it change over time or not?
I'm trying to recall. In this particular work, I don't remember there being much of a change in the crack propagation speed over that time period. And I'm trying to remember the other work. I don't think we saw huge changes in the propagation speed in that work. But I can't really recall for sure. I don't know if Basti's still on, if he remembers, or Alec, if either of you remember that, whether or not we saw big changes in the propagation speed. Yeah, I think I'm not too sure. Oh, there's Alec. Yeah.
We got Alec here.
I think in the longer term study, where also with Ben, the one we published before, where we looked at several days, we did see an increase in crack propagation speed. But yeah, on the bunker, I don't think there was a substantial trend we could see. You would expect one, but we didn't really see anything. But yeah, this is not a good answer. Sorry.
That's better than the one I had.
Okay, I'm also just pulling out the paper, trying to see the graph. For the meanwhile, we have another live question from Chris Pierce. Can we get Chris? Yeah, unfortunately, I can't hear Chris. I'll ask you something else, Carl, because there was an interesting question that people sent in when they watched your movie, and they said they were interested in those variations that you've seen when across the block when you prepared the slabs, and they were wondering whether these variations that you see in the handmade slabs, they are similar to the variations we might find in nature, and maybe in wind slabs in avalanche starting zones. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, we were actually I was certainly very surprised by the amount of variation we saw over the 120 centimeter distance. You know, we didn't see that much variation in the depth. Our depths range from about 9 centimeters up to 11 centimeters, so plus or minus 10% for that 10 centimeter slab we were trying to build. But we did see variations in the amount of, you know, in the hardness. Now, I think if you, just my experience, you know, I haven't made these measurements, but just my experience is if you go into a wind-loaded area, you're going to see even more dramatic changes than we saw there. And I don't know, you know, I know that you know, many years ago, we made a lot of snow micropen measurements and saw variability with those snow micropen measurements, but I can't remember how much variability we saw over those shorter distances. And Ben, I know you did a fair number of snow micropen measurements. Did you do some in some wind-loaded areas? And what did those? Do you recall what the variability was in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, in areas where you have a lot of wind effect, variability is usually high, and yeah, especially slab thickness or the density might change quite rapidly, and we know that these properties have an effect on the crack propagation propensity.
Yeah.
Okay, Carl. Yeah, thanks for wrapping it up for us, and also for answering those questions. And if I could try to put in a nutshell here, I would say Carl looked at the weak layer and slab properties and how they affect crack propagation. So the second part in the avalanche release process, particularly at the onset where we use the propagation saw test. And I think there is a fair amount of work to be still done and things to figure out how structural changes in the snow, be they driven by densification or metamorphism, like sintering of these processes, affect the weak layer and the slab properties, and how they come together and they change the critical crack length. Thank you, Carl.
Awesome.
And
hey, thank you.
And with that, we hand over to Bruce, who is introducing the next speaker.
Right. Thanks, Ben, Carl, and to all those who asked questions. So our next presenter is Ron Simenhois, who's from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. Ron worked as a ski patroller and avalanche forecaster in Colorado, New Zealand, and Alaska. In addition to his forecasting jobs, he's also collaborated with scientists from the US and Europe on applied research projects. Ron's work includes the development of the extended column test with Carl Birkeland, as well as other avalanche forecasting tools. Ron enjoys spending time outside with his wife and 2 kids. He also excels at coffee drinking and afternoon naps. So we started this session with Bastian talking about crack speeds at scales up to the slope scale. Ron's presentation video about analyzing videos to track slab deformation at the slope scale during the release of a real avalanche. Just before our discussion gets going here, Ron's going to summarize his results in a couple of minutes. Over to you, Ron.
Hi, and really thank you for attending and putting together this workshop. In my presentation, I use video magnification to track slab deformation across the start zone during dry slab avalanche release of one avalanche. When we look at this, sorry about that. When we look at the slab deformation sequence in this avalanche, we notice that the slab avalanche, notice that the avalanche started, a weak layer failure expanded in the downslope direction first. As the slab lost its support over a large area, cracks started to propagate in a cross-slope direction. And only at about 3/4 of a second or 3 snowboarder turns after we already knew the fate of the slope, we start seeing cracks on the surface. When we look at the weak layer fracture speed, we notice that it changes as the crack advances across the start zone. It increases as it got further away from the initiation point and slowed down as it got closer to the edge of the avalanche release, the release area. And the maximum downslope propagation speed was higher than the cross-slope propagation speed. To summarize, we reconfirmed that mucking around in steep avalanche terrain can be dangerous. Avalanche release is fairly complex process, and this work is very preliminary. If you want to help with this work, I'm looking for good videos of avalanche release. Please drop me a note if you have any. And here on the right lower side, you can see my email.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, I'm really amazed what you can get out of a small video. What kind of videos do you need? Is a smartphone video okay, or do you really need a video taken with a bigger camera or something?
Bigger camera is better. Smart video, it needs to be really good smartphone, because the lens itself is not great and it's gonna deform the video as you try to stabilize it.
Okay.
So good video, high frame rate, it's always better.
Yeah. Okay. The questions we see here, they are somehow concerned with, yeah, what do you see at the surface? I mean, the video is taken from captures the snow surface and the movements there. Is that really what's going on further below in the weak layer? And I will read one question to you, and they ask here, do you think it is possible that the actual crack propagation speed in the weak layer is different than what you see at the surface?
Well, I think what we see at the surface has some delay, and also depend on spatial variability. The deformation after the crack actually propagate from the crack tip till it gets to the surface. There is some delay, and the thicker the slab and the softer the slab, or the changes in elasticity probably change in how it's reflect on the surface. But if you look in, if we're assuming that it's fairly uniform across the slope, or at least down the slope, and we're looking at Johan talk, they're going to come after mine, you can see that the changes, they following up each other. It might be delayed, but it can give us a good indication of fracture speed. One thing I add is we don't really know how the crack propagate on the weak layer underneath. If it's make the same, straight line to where we see the deformation, it might be actually going through a different path. So it might be actually faster, I think, than what we see.
Okay, you already mentioned the downslope and the cross slope components, and yeah, the question is out there whether we have, or you have an idea why cross slope propagation should be slower than downslope propagation. I mean, if it starts at one point and spreads out, you would assume that it's just as fast in all directions, but you don't see that in the videos, do you?
Not in the video I was looking at. And again, this is one avalanche, so it's kind of hard to say it's always the case. But if it's steep enough, I think steeper than the friction of the weak layer, it might change to different fracture mode. So I don't think it's too far of a leap to expect different fracture speed. And Johan is here and he can jump in and give us his 2 cents or correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we will ask Johan about different fracture modes, downslope and cross slope. There's another question here, and I'll read it to you, Ron. And they are asking, do you think that in understanding fracture mechanics, it is worthwhile to use your technique and also find a way to measure the actual crack speed in the weak layer at the same time to see the relationship between the two?
Definitely. It would be a great idea to try to verify it if we can actually measure crack speed at the weak layer. And I think what I saw is it's also interesting to see actually the development of an avalanche, how it propagates, weak layer fracture propagates across a slope. It could have some other application than just measuring crack speeds. If we know how it propagates across a slope, we might be able to do some sort of fencing or avalanche defense that maybe minimize the impact on the slope, for example, and stop avalanches while they're still small.
Okay. I have a technical question to you, Ron. When you get these videos, I mean, it's all white on the video. How can the algorithm really track the position? I guess contrast is important, or how does it work?
Yeah, so the contrast is important, and part of the algorithm is basically aggregate neighboring pixels, so you can capture very, very small changes that you're typically not going to capture in a single pixel, or also going to reduce noise that you might find in a single pixel if you're going to follow it. So we're looking for very small changes, and then big part of the algorithm is try to actually figure out the frequency of the changes in the slab. Which that's harder part of the process. But yeah, there's pretty smart people figured this algorithm out, and I just wrote code for that.
Yeah, so you're actually looking at how these patterns of contrast move, no?
Yeah, the pixel intensity or how bright those blocks of pixels are.
Yeah. There's a question here from Travis, and he would like to know, would you anticipate that a trigger with more force applied to the surface, like an explosive, for instance, creates faster crack speeds?
I don't know exactly, probably closer to the initiation point, that might be the case. From my video, I can see that closer to the initiation point, its fracture speed is a little slower, and then it picks up as it gets further away from the initiation point, and probably as it goes into a steeper slope section. When we use an explosive, we are affecting large area of the slope. So initially, I would expect it is, and further out, further away from the initiation point, I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's another one here by, no, we already answered that one, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Ron, so far. So what I take from your talk, I guess, is, yeah, we should send in movies, and you can look at them, and you can maybe back out those speeds, and then we can complete a little bit the picture for speeds and avalanche sizes, so that the last part on the big scale that Basti showed in the beginning, where he's looking at the PST and you are actually looking at the avalanches. Okay, thanks, Ron, for being here with us today, and the great work you did. And with this, I hand back to Bruce.
Don't we have another 10 minutes here for the discussion?
Yes.
We do have more time, but there's not so much coming in for the moment, so I think we can keep going. And if there are more questions for Ron, we can also ask him later, because I guess Ron will stick around.
Okay, Ethan, do you want us to hold off until 10:35 before we start the next speaker, in case people are tuning in? Okay. Oh, and Carl has a question, and Ethan answered yes to my question. So, Carl, do you want to turn on your mic and your video and ask your question?
Hey, Ron. This is really good work. Excited to see. I'm wondering what you would think about applying these same techniques to a skier who doesn't trigger an avalanche, and whether we might be able to get some idea from these videos. Do you think it'd be possible to get some ideas from these videos, from this video magnification technique, on what size area that skier is disturbing? I know it'd just be looking at the surface, so we wouldn't necessarily know the disturbance at the weak layer, but might we get an idea of the area that a skier would disturb by looking at a skier that doesn't trigger an avalanche?
Yeah, so we did look at a person skiing down the slope without triggering an avalanche. And what we could see is a bubble basically following the skier. I didn't try to measure the size of the bubble, or I didn't have any information about the snowpack, but we can see some bubble. I'm not really sure how it's actually penetrate and affect the weak layer, but we might be able to see some sort of a stress field around that person, the skiing or snowboarding.
How big was the bubble that you were observing?
The bubble was the radius of the bubble was around the size of the skier. So, you know, I can say the diameter or from one edge to the other was over 3 meters.
Mm-hmm. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carl, for your question. Yeah, there's probably a little delay here. I see now another question from Montse from Valdaran, and she's asking, hi Ron, really exciting research. What are the criteria for the good avalanche videos that you are looking for? Do you think good snowpack characteristics would also be interesting? So I guess she has some videos and some, maybe even some profiles.
Yeah, that'd be great. So what I'm looking for is videos from relatively stable photographer, so it doesn't bounce around, it doesn't change angle too much, and then just high quality. If you have the higher quality, the better. Raw videos are better. A video that no one tried to edit, working much better. And then if you have snowpack information with those videos, that's going to be really, really good, so we can actually correlate what we see to snowpack properties.
Okay, great. I think with this information, some of our attendees, they might now go into their databases and find some good avalanche videos for you, Ron. Alec has another live question, I see. Can we hand the mic to Alec?
Yeah, no, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Ron, thanks again. As always, very, very interesting stuff you're doing. Very innovative. So I think it's cool to see what you've done with those videos. So I have a couple questions. One is purely on the video analysis part. Did you look at different color palettes, or did you use grayscale images? Do you know the algorithm?
Yeah, so what I use is basically looking at all three channels of red, green, and blue.
Okay, so you don't, not separately in any way.
Not separately, so
Okay.
it basically enhance the different channels.
Okay, yeah. And then with your crack speed, it seems that if you look at the crack speed relative to the trigger point, you end up with speeds, let's say between 50 and 30 meters per second, right?
Yes.
But if you look at relative to the previous crack location, then you get much higher speeds. more than 100 meters per second.
Yes, that's
so
true.
you think you might be looking at two different things? Maybe the one is the weak layer propagation and the other one would be tensile crack propagation?
That would be my guess. I don't have information on how steep was the slope, so it's kind of hard to assess. If it was steep enough. You know, we can make assumption that it was a snowboarding video in Alaska, so it probably wasn't very flattering. So it could be, yeah, that'll be my guess, but again, it's my guess. It's not, I don't have data to support it.
Yeah. No, cool, thanks.
Thanks, Alec.
There's another question coming in from Sam, and oh no, sorry, it's a live question Sam would like to ask. Can we have Sam?
Hi, Ron. Good morning.
Hey, Sam.
My question is, we've seen these high-speed videos of looking at propagation saw tests with black paint speckled on them. Does your video magnification have any utility for these PST videos?
They can, just don't really see the benefit of trying to do it because we already have pretty good tools of analyzing those PST columns. So yes, but we already have pretty good tools to do it. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, that answers my question. That the software that we're using to look at the digital image correlation is adequate to answer the questions we're looking to solve.
Yeah, and you know, Alec and Basti can chime in and say, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the case.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. I mean, this is exactly why we put this black paint on a PST wall. It's to increase the contrast, to have more contrast than you would with a normal snow wall. So I don't think there's a need to then use any kind of image processing to improve it. It's the whole point of putting the dark snow on top of it.
Thank you.
Okay. There is another question here from Alexandra. She's asking how useful would be video measurements you are doing to cross-reference with measurements like done for the WUMPS talk with accelerometers?
It'll be good. It can verify we can verify the video analysis to see how well it works and how accurate we manage to capture those changes in slab deformation. You know, it might vary as we go into steeper terrain, but definitely gonna be good again to verify and cross-reference those methods.
Yeah, thank you, Ron, for being here for the questions and yeah, giving this little wrap up. Yeah, I think you had very good feedback on your presentation. The work you're doing, people are very interested, and yeah, carry on and then keep on looking on this on these last parts of the avalanche release process at the dynamic part and the sliding. We are very interested in the deformation and those values of speed that you might finally back out with the algorithm. Thank you, Ron.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah, over to you, Bruce.
Okay, thanks to Ron and Ben and to all the folks in that discussion. It was good to see the other panelists chipping in here, and good questions from all those 450 some odd people who are out there. Our next presenter is Johan Gaume. For his graduate studies in Grenoble, France, and postdoctoral studies at the Swiss Institute for Snow Avalanche Research, Johan Gaume applied numerical modeling to snow slabs during the failure process and to avalanches in motion. He now applies the material point method to modeling snow failure and avalanche motion. This modeling method was used in the Disney movie Frozen. Dr. Gaume is currently a professor in Lausanne, Switzerland, where he heads the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory. The talks in this session have been about the critical crack length, crack propagation speeds, and slope deformation during avalanche release. Professor Gaume's presentation video applies the material point method to all those stages of avalanche release, but also to avalanche motion, avalanche impact, and potentially hazard mapping. Before our discussion, Joan's going to summarize his results in a couple of minutes. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting down this very exciting workshop. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Ben, as well. And yeah, I'm truly excited because a lot of research is going on at the same time with different approaches. And when we put all these things together, we will better understand what's going on, I think, with crack propagation during snow slab avalanche release. And so in this presentation, I will show you what we have done since we developed this model with the UCLA researchers and engineers that developed the MPM model in the Disney movie Frozen. I first want to acknowledge my colleagues who helped putting down these slides and all the work that I've shown. And yeah, here, this is the start of the story. So in 2019, I went to UCLA to work with the people who did the snow graphics in the Disney movie Frozen. And based on this work that we extended and further developed, we managed to simulate the release and flow of an avalanche at the slope scale. And so what I show in this presentation is the work that we have done since that. And this is summarized here. Maybe I put this here. We performed some small-scale simulation at the scale of snow microstructure to better understand the mechanical behavior of snow. We also did simulation of the propagation saw test using different methods, so using the discrete element method and also using the MPM material point method. So that's what you see here, and that's what mostly related to this session. So I might talk a little bit more about this. We used also DEM to better calculate avalanche impact pressures, simulations of avalanche dynamics on forested slopes as well. And we tried to see what type of forest arrangement would have the best protective effect, best avalanche protection. And also discrete element simulations have been done in which snow properties are changing in time as temperature increases, to study the transition from a cold and dense snow avalanche to a snow in which granules are forming, and then eventually to a very warm and slow plug. And finally here, this last video on the lower right, I don't know if you see it, it's a simulation of avalanche dynamics in Vallée de la Sion, so on complex terrain. And you see that we are able to simulate also the granules forming and snow compaction during the dynamics of the avalanche. But I want to quickly go back on crack propagation because I think this is really connected to the other talks. And what we see is a clear transition between a very slow speed, rather slow speed, around 30 meters per second for PSTs on rather flat slopes, to a very large speed, which depends mostly on slab properties. And this speed is higher than the speed of the shear wave velocity. So it's called a super shear crack propagation. And this might explain why the speeds recorded in propagation saw test are smaller than the ones that are reported based on video analysis. So the pink curve here is based on avalanche videos based on the paper of Dave Amray. And so I'm very glad to discuss this in the framework of what has been presented before, because I think this is very relevant also for practical research. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the question.
Yeah, thank you, Johan, for wrapping it up again. With your team there in Lausanne, you're using the material point method, and you're actually managing to link the scales now all the way from the from the failure in the weak layer to the sliding of the avalanche. And yeah, I really like that. And it also gives us confidence that our picture of avalanche release that we're having with all those steps, initiation, propagation, dynamic phase, and sliding, that this picture can't be that wrong. I mean, if you put it all together, we see an avalanche in the end. Would you agree?
Yes, I totally agree. So first, sorry for the camera. It's not that it's so it's a really bad quality, so I cannot really improve that. And so I would agree. It's just that the most recent findings that we have, and it's based not only on the MPM method that we developed in Lausanne, but also on the DEM model on which Grégoire Bobier is working in Davos. Both of them, they suggest that we have a sharp transition in mode of crack propagation. So at first, we need collapse, we need bending to be able to propagate cracks on rather flat terrain. But if the slope is steep enough, after a certain length that we call supercritical crack length, because it's not the same as the one that you need to trigger the propagation, it's a different one which is larger. After this length, the crack will propagate way faster. And it's not influenced anymore by the bending, because there is so much gravitational load that is pulling the slab down on the slope that bending becomes negligible compared to that. And so I hope that this can explain what we see in the field, but we need more, I would say, experimental research to be certain of that. But the fact that two different methods reproduce this phenomenon gives us some confidence. So, yeah.
Yeah, Jean, you mentioned again the supercritical crack length. There were a couple of questions on that, and you can imagine. Maybe you can, with easy words, make again the difference between the critical crack length that we measure in a propagation saw test and what this supercritical crack length means.
So how can I explain that? If we think of Coulomb friction, it assumes that if the shear force becomes larger than the static friction coefficient times the normal force, then everything should slide at once. But in reality, it doesn't happen like this. There is a certain delay. There is a speed associated to the sliding of the material. And basically what we show here is that there is a first critical crack length to start propagating a failure, which is rather slow. But then you need a second critical crack length for the slab to slide. But the sliding of the slab is also associated with a second phase of crack propagation, which is called super shear crack propagation. And this is something that is also observed in earthquakes. And so I'm not sure if I managed to explain it in simple words, but because it's a very recent result that we have, I hope I can manage to do better next time.
How do the lengths compare between the one we're used to and the new super critical crack length?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. Maybe that will explain it better. So typically the critical crack length that we have in the PST are the order of a few, like from 10 to 50 centimeters. And this supercritical crack length is of the order of several meters. So typically from 3 to 5 meters. And that's, this value is really well reproduced by McClunk's shear model. Yeah.
Johan, where would you measure this supercritical crack length? Would you measure it from the onset of the crack out, or how would you measure that?
I mean, the best would be to use the technique of Alec on a real slope, but the slope needs to be large enough. So typically, because we need more than 3 to 5 meters on a, let's say, 35-degree slope. So I would say that we would need at least like a 20-meter slope to see that. But this is something that we might already observe in the videos of Ron, because he has a crack speed that locally goes at around 100 meters per second. So that's also very promising. I mean, we discussed this with Ron, and I hope we can manage to link those things. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's very interesting to to hear about these new developments right from you and have this discussion here. Johan, you showed examples of cracks that propagated at different speeds. What are the factors that influence crack propagation speed? You mentioned the slope angle was important. When you say that, is that for the PST part of it, or is that when the crack becomes supercritical?
It's a very good question, because these results, they may lead to the conclusion that the PST is too short to measure everything. But the good news is we can kind of predict the speed now. And what I want to say is that if the slope angle is large enough, we have a transition. So below this transition, the speed will be controlled by both the speed of the elastic wave speeds in the slab and the speed of the elastic wave speeds in the weak layer. However, if the propagation distance is large enough, and if the slope angle is large enough as well, then the speed is only related to the slab properties. It's only the slab that is driving the speed, and it's slightly larger than the shear wave velocity, so basically related to the elastic modulus of the slab and the density of the slab. So that's basically the result of this. And the good news is, if you know the PST speed, based on this model, you might be able to predict the speed that you would get on a slope.
Great. We have a live question here from Bastian. Maybe we can get the mic to Bastian.
Hi, Johan. Can you hear me?
Hi, Basti. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation. It's always nice to see the graphics and what is possible with the MPM and DEM. Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you think the supercritical state where it turns into the shear crack propagation is the rule, so it happens always, or is it more the exception that it just happens if the slab weak layer system is prone to it, or the failure envelope is somehow special?
A good question, very good question. So we tried with many different properties. It always happens, except if the slab is too weak. So basically, you can have it even if the slab breaks. So you can have a supercritical crack propagation even if you have slab fractures, but you have a critical slab density, let's say, for which the slab fracture will prevent this transition from happening. So for realistic values of the parameters, we see that even if the slab can break, this transition will happen. But I would say that for soft slab, very soft slab, this might not be the case because of the weakness of the slab itself, I would say.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe another one, a short one. The supercritical crack length is a couple of meters long, you said. So yeah, maybe too long for PSTs, but maybe, or do you think there's an option that the supercritical crack length is shorter in the PST because they are one-dimensional, or rather one-dimensional?
I mean, yeah, that's something that we discussed also with Grégoire and Bertil, and we thought that the boundary conditions in the PST could also lead to this. But it seemed that it only works when we do big PSTs. So we never managed to get this type of transition, or maybe just close to the end, because at the end, you know, due to boundary effect, it will propagate very fast, but you don't have this like permanent fast regime to analyze.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, very interesting to listen to the pros of crack propagation here. There's another question from Florian Hörler. Let's get the mic to Florian.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see that those questions are being addressed from multiple angles. And it's also great to see, Johan, I think you're also excited about this.
Yeah.
My question is concerned with the difference between the field measurements on the one hand and then numerical experiments by mechanical models or based on mechanical models on the other hand. So Johan, what do you think? What can we learn from each of them individually that we can't learn from the other one? And what are the strengths of combining these two information sources or the two approaches?
Yeah, good question. I think, for example, if I put a concrete example, if we look at the graph that Alec showed in his presentation, in which you see those 4 points, and it seemed that we have a linear increase of the crack propagation speed with crack propagation distance. And in my opinion, the points are correct, but I wouldn't put a straight line there. The model suggests that it's rather a low speed for short distance and then a transition to these points which are higher up. So because we have limited amount of data, I think the model can help to get the trends that might be missing due to this limited amount of data. But yeah, I think those videos that Ron is analyzing might also help a lot to validate what we are not completely sure about. We might need to bring spatial variability as well to see if we may have some effect of spatial variability on crack propagation. But yeah, as you said, this is very exciting because it all happens more or less at the same time. So it's really great.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you, Florian, for your question. There's a question here that I see from Joey Thompson, and he would like to know whether supercritical crack length has a relationship to grain type, so to weak layer properties. Would you see differences with new non-persistent grain types, for instance, compared to depth hoar, Johan? What do you think?
Well, so in our model, we don't really put grain type. So in our model, we have a weak layer and its properties are basically cohesion and friction, let us say. So the only thing I can say that the supercritical crack length depends a lot on cohesion and friction. So I would say obviously a grain type, in my opinion, will influence this length. But from modeling, I cannot answer in a very concrete manner because we don't have these grain types directly modeled.
Johan, you said earlier that for the supercritical crack length, so for this later part of crack propagation, the slab properties are crucial, whereas for the onset, slab and weak layer properties are very important. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Yes, that's perfectly right. That's what it seems to be actually for the speed. The best fit that we could get for the speed for the anti-crack part, like let's say the slow part, is basically square root of slab speed times weak layer speed. So that's what comes out of the modeling, whereas for the supercritical crack propagation, it's only slab. I mean, we did several simulations with a lot of different properties, and the supercritical speed collapses with elastic modulus and density of the slab only, and is not influenced by weak layers. So, yeah.
Yeah, Johan, Carl has a question for you here.
Yep.
Johan, that was really good, and I'm glad to see all the work that your group is doing. It's exciting stuff. So in your video, you talked about how some of the work that Dave McClung does applies mainly to the dynamic crack propagation. So maybe on the order of, over 5 meters or 8 meters or something like that. And I'm curious, can you say what approach is more or less appropriate at these shorter distances? Is that more some of the work that you've done before with mixed mode anti-crack type approach, or are you thinking that maybe there's something different that needs to be done?
So yeah, I think for the normal critical crack length, it appears that we need to include bending and weak layer collapse, so to reproduce the critical crack length. However, for this supercritical crack length, yeah, the pure shear model seems to be appropriate. So I would go like this. If you're interested in this in the PST critical crack length, you need more ingredients than the pure shear model. but basically what I would say is, for now, we still need to know what is the practical relevance of knowing this supercritical crack length. This is not clear yet. For us, it's a very exciting a mechanical result, but for me, the fact that the speed increases a lot has a practical relevance, but then the length at which it will occur, we still need to work on that, like to understand how that would be relevant. Do we need it in practice or not? Or if we just know that there will be a transition, that the speed will reach a certain value, maybe this is enough. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Really interesting stuff. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carl.
Yeah, thanks, guys. There are many more questions here for Johan. I think some of them they will address you maybe directly in the chat later. And just one really short one I wanna bring up, and I think it's also a short answer. Did you are you going to look at damage also? So if you think about natural release in your model, are you going to take account of that?
This is work that we want to do. This is not what we are currently doing. So right now we can't do natural release. We don't have strain rate dependency, so healing. We want to include that in the future. The only annoying thing about that is that the simulation timescales become complicated, because our simulations are already quite intense. They need time. But if you need also to take into account the slow process before the release, then it's going to be complicated. And I just want to end up with one last thing that you brought before. It was a comment, a question to Ron. We did 3D simulations of crack propagation, and the speed on the sides goes 2 times slower than the speed downslope, approximately. That's what. It's just I had this question in mind also.
Yeah, thanks for answering that question too, Johan. Yeah, I'll wrap it up real quick. Johan and his crew, they have a big machine. They can calculate everything related to avalanches, and they are developing it further. And the latest thing they found in our picture of avalanche release is that there's a transition in the crack propagation process, and there is something called supercritical crack growth, and the speed there is driven by the slab properties, whereas at the onset of crack propagation, it's weak layer and slab properties that drive the crack speed. And yeah, there's more to come, and they can link the scales, and they will hopefully complete the pictures and be able to use all the measurements that the community is performing and put them together. Thank you, Johan, here.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Bruce.
Okay, and thanks all to all the speakers. I think it was amazing here, the diversity that we saw, going everything from the small scale up to the slope scale, and also some fairly straightforward field measurements, and up to some very sophisticated MPM modeling. So this was great, and I really want to thank the presenters as well as the organizers. I don't know how they got such talent here for this session, but it's really quite amazing, and this is exactly what we all hoped for in a virtual workshop. And any final comments, Ben?
Yeah, I hope that in the next years we can see each other in person and discuss those findings and those advances. And again, also from my side, thank you. A big thank you to all the speakers, and thanks for moderating together, Bruce.
Great. Thanks all. Great. And to start the break, Ethan, are you going to jump in here?
Yeah. Thanks, you guys. Bruce and Ben, that was great. The way that you kept that conversation going, that was really what we were hoping for. And yeah, really impressive set of speakers, and an amazing amount of work. One of my impressions from watching the video was the density of the work that Johan's group is doing. Just presenting what he did over the last year in 30 minutes was pretty amazing to watch. And And yeah, I was really struck by just how the science of this is progressing. You know, we just did a whole session mostly on how cracks are propagating through the snow, and I really enjoyed hearing people talk about the different weak layer and slab properties, changes in scale, and you know, connecting it what Bastian did with spatial variability. So thanks to everybody. That was wonderful. And thanks a lot to the audience as well for your questions. We really encourage you to keep asking questions. We're getting more questions, obviously, than we can cover within this session, but we are keeping track of those, and we will try to get them to the speakers and give them a chance to answer them if they want to. We're not really sure how we're going to do that, but we've got another couple hours, couple days to figure that out. There is a question that was submitted about seeing the other questions, and we will try to address that as well. So we're now going to take a short break. Definitely need a breather after that session. It was we're definitely missing the beer as part of these discussions, but for those of you in Europe, maybe it's late enough in the day you can do that, and for us in North America, I guess we'll have to hold off for a little bit. We are going to come back at 10 after for a talk with DINAFIT, and then we'll start the next session at a quarter after. You can stay logged into Zoom, so if you just want to walk away from the computer for a little bit, get a little exercise, and come back, that's totally fine. And yeah, take advantage of the break. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. That break went too quick for me, but we have an exciting presentation from one of our sponsors at DINAFIT. So Ross Herr is going to tell us a little bit about some of the equipment that DINAFIT is manufacturing for ski touring.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me on board.
Perfect. Thank you, Ross. Take it away.
So really, I guess more so or less so about the equipment and things that we're working on was more to follow up on our kind of tech talk videos that we sent out as, you know, part of the curriculum. We're excited to sponsor the Seesaw event here, and also just to participate in the conversation about you know, knowing your gear and how that is a big component of the safety in the mountains here. So you know, a lot of the emphasis that we put on our little tech talk that we put in is about really the basics of making sure that your adjustment is correct right away when you start your day, and just keeping snow and debris out of your system as you're going. And so, you know, we kind of broke it down into the look, listen, and feel sort of component of signs or alarms that something's just not right. You know, these are things that are really easy to ignore. You know, something on your way up the skin track, maybe just not working quite right, you know, and it's an easy thing to skip over and you know, can cause an issue on your way down. So yeah, we wanted to open it up to questions and kind of a discussion about that. And then also our sister brand Pomoka, and you know, just some basics of skins. You know, skins are a huge safety piece in getting in and mostly out of the backcountry. So, you know, some of the basics as far as applying your skins correctly, drying them out overnight, storing them in a cool location, putting them on with a little bit of pressure and friction, and then, you know, how to manage it if you do get snow and ice on your glue, are just a couple of things we wanted to emphasize to everybody and see if there was questions. And then, you know, on the spacing topic with our bindings, it's, you know, just making sure that those visuals are followed. A lot of people change bindings or loan to a friend or let someone, you know, mess with something over the summer, or, you know, if you turn back your release values in this winter time or in the summertime before you put it back. So yeah, these are all just the key components to having a safe day in the mountains is following up on these things and doing your due diligence to keep track of those pieces. And then, of course, I thought I'd throw up a couple of visuals here on just how precise that interface is between your boot and your toe piece of your binding. And I really emphasize, the toe piece connection because it has the tightest tolerance and is the most important piece to your system as far as where the most stress and pressure and where also, you need the most reliability. So yeah, just, those couple of quick points wanted to throw out there and then open it up and see if there's any questions from the crew here about, maintaining and safe keep of their skins, boots, and bindings.
Hey Ross, this is Ethan. I have a question for you. I'm kind of an old school guy, so please forgive this, but the skin savers, do I really need to use those things?
Yeah, that's sort of a brand specific thing. The Pomoka glue is a little bit different. It's a cold formula glue that is supposed to kind of maintain its tackiness. And so we actually don't apply as much glue. And so we don't provide skin savers with Pomoka skins or Dynafit skins, and they should be pretty easy to pull apart. If you have like really tacky skins and it's really challenging to pull apart, that's where those skin savers are gonna come in handy. And also they're, like even the packaging that your skins comes in, when you store it for the summer, those aren't a bad way to go and just preserve your life. Anytime you have that real aggressive pull, your chance of damaging your glue is much higher. And the good point on that too is a lot of people will have really sticky skins on a dry ski, and a dry ski base will actually like cause your skin glue to stick too much. And that's another way that you can kind of damage your glue when pulling your skins off of your skis if your wax is overly dry.
Great, thanks a lot. I really appreciate that. I'm always looking to reduce the amount of fiddling that I'm doing with my gear in the backcountry, so that's super helpful. We are gonna get ready to start our next session, but thanks a lot for that tech talk, and we'll welcome you back tomorrow for round 2.
Right on. Thanks for letting us be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, we really appreciate your support, and it's great to have you involved. Thanks a lot, Ross.
All right. Take care.
Okay, so our next session is on avalanche mapping and modeling. Again, a pretty amazing set of talks that people put together for this. So if you didn't do your homework, I know I didn't get through all of mine, but there's a lot of content that you can watch over the next month. So make sure that you go through all those talks, because each one of them are really good. I did watch the ones for this session. I'm still working on the stuff for Friday. So our next set of moderators are Jeff Deems and Mike Cooperstein. Jeff Deems, many of you probably know, he's been a regular speaker at CSAW over the years and at lots of different ISSWs. He is a researcher at the University of Colorado Snow and Ice Data Center and is a co-founder of Airborne Snow Observations. He's done a lot of work with LiDAR and looking at snow processes and complex terrain, both for avalanches and hydrological applications. Mike Cooperstein, aka Coop, is the lead forecaster for the Northern Mountains at the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. He has a long history of working in the mountains and in snow and avalanches. He actually began his snow and avalanche career in West Virginia as a ski patroller, moved to out west to Bozeman to do a degree in biology, worked ski patrolling for many years at the Yellowstone Club, including being the snow safety and assistant ski patrol director. Ended up doing a master's degree there, looking at surface or near surface faceting, and ran a guiding service internationally, but a lot of it focused in the Andes for many years. So with that, I will turn it over to Coop and Deems, and I'll see you at the end of the session.
Great, thanks, Ethan. Great. I want to make sure to give a shout out to Ethan and the CAIC crew, and also the friends of CAIC for putting on this, putting on Seesaw this year in the headwinds of the current pandemic. I'm really stoked to see everyone here virtually and get to explore a lot of this great content from our participants. Let's jump right into the session on avalanche mapping and modeling. We've got a couple great talks on mapping avalanche terrain and mapping terrain exposure. We've got a talk discussing some new technology for mapping snow depth from a drone and applying that to a specific avalanche event. And then also a talk discussing using remote sensing to map avalanche occurrence. So our first speaker is Stefan Harvey from the VSL Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research in Davos. He's been a staff member there since 1998, focusing on avalanche forecasting, accident analysis, statistical modeling, avalanche prevention and training, and avalanche education. He's also the project manager and author of the White Risk Avalanche Prevention Portal. That's their primary forecast dissemination tool there at the SLF. He's a mountain guide and also a judicial expert in avalanche accidents. So Stephen, if you're online there, can you spin up your talk summary and we'll get going.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for having the talk here. Thanks for everyone who was involved in organizing this session here. I would like to present a new methodology we presented 2 years ago at the CSAW in Innsbruck concerning automatic high-resolution mapping of the avalanche terrain, and this specifically for a skier trigger or for skier problems or the ski touring people. So now I have to switch to that. There we are. So the goal was to create a high-resolution avalanche terrain map for typical skier-triggered or concerning typical skier-triggered avalanches. So the maximum size of avalanches we look at here is size class 3, and we focused here on different zones which actually are important to look at when you go skiing in the backcountry. So first of all, we looked at the potential of avalanche release areas, then of the areas below these steep slopes, so areas where we typically can trigger avalanches remotely, and of course also the runout of potential avalanches. And of course, we also wanted to consider the consequences if you get caught in an avalanche, and we looked at some at the injury problem and also the potential of deep burial. Finally, we also analyzed these maps or validated these maps with about 870 mapped avalanches or skier-triggered avalanches all over Switzerland. And the results, there are some results you could see in the video I presented. So to look at these several areas, we looked at 5,000 mapped avalanches and looked at the terrain of the release area and used these terrain features to model the potential of release areas. For the areas where avalanches could get triggered remotely, we had a data set where we knew the distance from the triggering point to the release area and used this distance for modeling this potential of remote triggering. Then we used the RAMS simulation model, the RAMS extended model, to model 860,000 avalanches of maximum size class 3 all over Switzerland. And finally, with those three layers, with those three simulations or models, we could then create a specific classified avalanche terrain map. And in this map, you can see here, you can distinguish between release areas, which are reddish colors, or areas which typically are, or could be typically areas to trigger remotely. And the yellow zones are the maximum runouts of these RAM simulations. And then we also looked at the consequences of being caught by an avalanche and created two other layers which we then combined with the other three and merged them all together into a single avalanche terrain hazard map, which shows how serious or how severe the terrain is concerning release and consequences. So all these layers and maps give insight into different terrain features which are important to assess when we're out in the terrain, and conclusions we can make also with the validation we did showed that the methodology is feasible for mapping avalanche terrain on large scales. And we also saw that the runout zones calculated from RAMs are rather conservative. So most avalanches were far shorter than the runout zones. But that's also a good sign, of course. And we surely could do some others or simulate other scenarios. And of course, also improving the forest is also a big issue, because in this study here, we just distinguished between forest and no forest. And the forest were only areas where the trees are quite dense and classified as, and are quite dense and also quite high. So these maps, we now have two types of maps. They are available already for a while for the whole of Switzerland, and you can get a look at those if you want. Yeah, that's about a summary of the presentation you could look at before, and now yeah, I'm ready for questions from the audience.
Great, Stephen. Thanks a lot. The questions are already rolling in here, it looks like. So there is a question here from Mansi. What are the requisites and challenges to export your method to other regions with different terrain, different snow climates, and different snowpack characteristics?
Well, first of all, you need a good terrain model. We use terrain models with a 5-meter resolution, and we also need a forest layer to distinguish forest and no forest, at least that. And concerning the snow climate, well, the area of Davos where these avalanches were used for, or where these mapped avalanches were from, these 5,000 which we used to distinguish or to capture the release areas, they were mapped over a period of about 40 years. And during these 40 years, we surely had all sorts of winters. So some winters were more continental with less snow, and some others had a lot of snow, which were a bit more maritime. And Davos is also an area where we have some ranges which get much more snow than the others. So I would say we have a good mixture of all sorts of climates, but of course we do not have extreme climates. So we do not have West Coast climates like in Alaska, or no really continental climates like in Colorado. So maybe the extreme climates we do not capture in our area, but I would say a broad part of typical snow climates are within those avalanches. And concerning the RAMS model, we just presumed a certain scenario, and that you can change as you like for any snow climate.
Yeah, Stephen, that's great. And you know, we've had preliminary discussions about doing a pilot project with this in Colorado with you, and trying to look at tree cover and things like that. How do you think the model will work with tree cover? And is there a way to look at canopy density or tree density on a slope? And are you guys looking at doing that? You know, we have a lot of treed avalanche terrain down here.
Yeah, we are, or the RAMS group, so with Yves and Perry, they already did some simulations with newer forest layers, because our forest groups with Peter Baby, they developed a new forest layer, which also looks at the canopy and also at the density of the trees, and therefore can distinguish between all sorts of tree, kind of tree densities. and therefore we are working on that topic as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I hope we can do some of that down here with you guys and see how that model works. We have a live question from Ian Hoyer, it looks like.
Yeah, hey there, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So this is really cool work. I'm just wondering, in terms of, we obviously have, the resolution and the microterrain, and then also the forest, and it just making me, as a research tool for us thinking about it, it seems awesome. But do you have worries about, putting out a map like this to the public as a forecaster? Just freaks me out that people are going to be taking this and not looking at the field data, and they're going to be relying on it more than we would hope. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, of course, a lot of thoughts. Well, first of all, I have to say these maps just tell or give information about the terrain. So it does not tell anything about the avalanche conditions, which change all the time. And we also clearly say that these maps only are useful for avalanches up to a certain size, or speaking into danger levels, we recommend to use those maps maximum or typically in the lower 3 danger levels from 1 to 3, and maybe a low high danger would fit as well. But as soon as we have to expect very large avalanches, then those runouts, of course, are too short. And that we communicate.
It looks like we have Go ahead, Stephen. It looks like we have a couple of follow-up questions along the same lines. So one is, how much ground truthing have you done? And have you seen any places in these maps where there have been obvious conflicts with what your initial assessment was, and you had different results somewhere along the way?
Well, I mean, it's hard to measure the ground truth of the terrain, but of course, just with, I mean, we looked at many areas, or we also know a lot of areas concerning the terrain, and compared the simulations and figured out, is that reasonable, yes or no. We also had several experts looking at those maps and giving us feedback. Yeah, so there was a certain exchange with guides, with experts, knowing the terrain from off by heart.
Yeah, no, that's great. So it wasn't just a computer model that was released to the public, and there wasn't anybody following up on it or checking out on any of those things. And that kind of flows into the next question of, were there any liability discussions before the map was released to the public on white risk?
Yeah, but as long as we just talk about terrain, I mean, we also use slope angle maps, and I mean, those are very well known at the public, or for the public, and we also recommend to use those maps to find good routes. And actually, our maps now here are just in addition to slope angle, because they also show the flatter areas, and they do not just say if it's below 30 degrees, it's no avalanche terrain anymore. So they really consider all sorts of aspects. But of course, yeah, we surely say it's not 100% sure. But I mean, if you want to go out skiing in avalanche terrain, that's something you have to cope with. And if not, you should stay off the backcountry.
Yeah, and you guys have 5-meter DEMs available to the public widely, correct? In Europe, in the States, we don't have that level of a DEM available quite as widely. So, we're looking at 10-meter DEMs or, something like that here, and that makes a big difference when you're choosing routes and doing other things like that. It looks like we have a live question from John Sykes. Can you unmute John, please?
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hey, thanks a lot, Stephen. That was a great presentation and great research. I was wondering about the white risk tool. Is it enabled for users to actually use these maps in the field, like a GPS enabled map where they can see themselves while they're traveling, or is it more of kind of a pre-trip planning tool?
It's both. So you can plan your trip with also all sorts of maps and layers. And if you're out in the field, you also can look on your smartphone where you are, and you can put all these layers on the map and you can compare the situation. So you actually can go out in the terrain, look at the slopes and look what your map is showing exactly there, and you can compare that. Yeah. And that's already available. Mm-hmm.
So Stephen, we have another question. How sensitive do you think your method is to the accuracy of and the size of the DEM pixels?
What do you mean with that?
Yeah, so is your method going to change with a 10-meter DEM or a bigger DEM?
Well, the big problem is the curvature, because for estimating the curvature, you need to look at several pixels. And when the pixels are larger or the resolution is higher, then of course, yeah, you cannot capture smaller gullies anymore as well than if the resolution is smaller. But I mean, you can calculate something, but it surely gets less accurate.
Yeah, that's great. Deems, do you have any questions?
I've got a bit of a follow-up to the climatology question. So I was really keen to see the integration of the empirical data from remote triggering into calculating that remote trigger area below the starting zones. What's your sense of the diversity of weak layers that were involved in those remote trigger accidents, and would that be, or incidents, and would that be a primary challenge in extending this to different regions?
I mean, we all know, first of all, you need a very weak snowpack that you can trigger remotely. And but we do not know how the snowpack looked like at these avalanches we used for that. Maybe there are a few, but there are surely not all those 75 avalanches we had. And some of these avalanches were from North America, and about 1/3 was from North America and 2/3 from Switzerland. So that covers a bit. But of course, it's a very small data set, but you still can see quite a nice correlation with the distance. Yeah.
That's great. It looks like we have a live question from Carl Birkeland. Carl, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Hey, thanks, and thanks, Stefan, for a great presentation. I had sort of a comment, and then I'll follow it up with a question. But the comment was just that I wanted folks to know that I've sort of been skeptical about sort of automated mapping like this in the past. But I was actually, when I was over there in Switzerland and saw the way the maps worked, I was really impressed with how well they worked in most situations. So yeah, I think it's a great thing for the public. I guess my question was a little bit related to Jeff's and something that I hadn't asked you before, but every time you get an accident in Switzerland, do you find yourself going back to these maps and taking a look at them and seeing, you know, how well they match with the accident location and or remote triggering and that sort of thing? And how have those matched up as you've gone back and looked at those?
Well, that's something I'm doing already for a while. Before we did these maps, of course, you always want to know, where did this avalanche happen? Would that happen also to me? Of course, you don't know how the snowpack looks like, but at least to know what kind of terrain it is. And for me now, of course, as soon as I know where an accident happens, I go and have a look on these maps and see were the maps more or less accurate or not. But of course, the maps do not tell you well, up to now, we luckily never had an accident where our maps were white. And the people were standing in the white color, but we do not say that the white areas or the areas where we do not map avalanche terrain is 100% sure, but they are certainly sure if the avalanches are not too large.
Nice, thanks.
So,
but the main thing of these maps, sorry, maybe, but the main thing is also to encourage people to think about the zones below steep slopes, that they really know how far an avalanche could run out, so they get a bit more aware of these run out zones, and also considering the consequences if you have the other kind of map we have where everything is mixed together. I would say for a beginner it's also quite a good solution just to see how severe the terrain is in general.
Carl, maybe before you drop off, since you've used both systems, do you think this would work in the US, and what do you think the pitfalls would be to bringing this kind of system over here?
Yeah, it seems to me like this would work. I mean, I think the main pitfalls would just be we have so much more terrain that is not alpine, that's below tree line. And so, you know, as Stefan has talked about in his presentation, there's challenges with that and trying to identify those areas, whereas a lot of the touring in Europe is over in alpine terrain. And then the other thing is just that, just making sure that I think things are definitely getting better over here in terms of our mapping, but the mapping over in Switzerland is so good that it's really those good maps that are helping to drive this. And then, of course, on top of that, we need, one of the real impressive things about what they've done is using this RAMS model to run all these hundreds of thousands of RAM simulations and get the run out. And so that would be a challenge for us to somehow, automate all those RAMS runs.
Great, thanks, Carl. Thanks, Stefan. Hopefully we'll get a chance to test some of this down in Colorado this winter. And if anybody else has any questions, please find Stefan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, thanks again, Stephen. And Stephen's talk provides a perfect segue into our next speaker, who is Grant Statham. He's a visitor safety specialist with Parks Canada, covering Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks. He and his crew are responsible for highway avalanche control, public bulletins, and search and rescue response in those parks. He's well known to the snow science and avalanche crowd. We've seen him around for a long time, and I personally always love Grant's talks. He's been a climber, forecaster, and mountain guide for 30 years, and with Parks Canada for 17 of those. He's also an avalanche risk consultant, adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University, and an Arc'teryx brand ambassador. Grant, really pleased you could be part of our session, and let her rip with your overview talk when you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you very much, you guys, and thanks for organizing to the CAIC and to the Friends and for the invite to join today. It's great to be part of this. I'll just share my screen here. That's going. So I thought I'd just use my intro to cover a slightly different topic than I did on my video. The video is about, and the project we've been working on here is to update the avalanche terrain exposure scale. Excuse me. I had two comments from people, both from Colorado, who said that they liked the talk. It was interesting because they hadn't had a lot of exposure to the system because it wasn't used so widely down there. So I thought I would just take my first couple of minutes here to show a couple of examples of different ways that the system's been used over the year, just to show you, it's mapping, it's guidebooks, it's in a variety of ways. And I thought this would be a good chance just to show that. So just to start us, here's the original avalanche terrain exposure scale, which is very simple, 3 levels, simple, challenging, and complex. Our modification that we've been working on for the last 2 years and will soon be done really bumps it to 5 levels. And you can see here, these are the 2 levels that we've added. Non-avalanche terrain, class 0, which is the hardest level to deal with, that's for sure. And also class 4 extreme terrain. So these are the two that we've added. And then I spoke earlier about a bunch of the background behind coming up with this. So I'm going to pass on that and just go through a few examples now, just to get through a few different ways it's used. So this is a Canadian example. This is the Avalanche Canada Trip Planner. This is just a screenshot, but if you went live online, you'll see a map of Western Canada with all the terrain mapping they've got on there. You can roll in close and it becomes a bit dynamic. You can see avalanche paths marked on there. You can link it with the danger ratings, and you can get kind of a risk set up between both the terrain rating and the danger rating. So a really good tool that Avalanche Canada has worked on for years. It's in lots of guidebooks. Here's just a simple example from the Coast Mountains guidebook north of Vancouver. Always it's a good opportunity because it provides a bit of a framework to talk about avalanche terrain. So most of the guidebooks seem to have a little setup right at the beginning where they talk about what the terrain means. And so it's a good chance to, you know, highlight avalanche terrain. And this is just a simple example of this trip is rated complex, and you know, it's part of however many different trips they have in that book. This is taken from a Beacon guidebook. This is around Crested Butte, and I've just been following how these guys have been developing the system there. You can see they use 8s in terms of arrows for the descents. So those are ski descents, and they're color coded. So the black one is a complex run. The blue one is a challenging run. That's another way of doing it. Reminds me of a Canadian heli ski map, actually, although we don't use 8s for that. This is a really interesting example, one that I really like. It's from the Val d'Aran in the Pyrenees, where they put it on Google Earth. And again, I can't spin it because it's a screenshot, but it's a really interesting way of looking at their mapping and how they modeled it out. And when you spin it around, you can get up pretty close and see how they've got the terrain laid out there. This is an example of how Norway has been working on it. And I believe they've done quite a bit of work since this. This is a screenshot I took. These are their public maps at the moment. And these are just from a far distance. You have to be scaled right out. And they show a simple example of how they have, and they've modified and made their own system, but it's similar to 8s. The Swedish have done the same thing. You can see here they have a combination of using kind of photographs to highlight different kinds of terrain. And here they blend it with maps as well. Just to step into a totally different realm, I mentioned in the video, we use it for workplace safety. This is an example of how we do it here. You can see the terrain across the top and qualifications on the left and who's allowed to go where. This is how it works. I work in a large organization with lots of people traveling in the mountains. Not everybody is trained for avalanches. So this is the workplace safety criteria we use, and it's used widely in Canada for this sort of thing. And one piece I wanted to highlight is I've used it quite a bit for teaching avalanche terrain. And as an example, I would give a blank one of these, and you can run a pretty good lesson with people on how to teach on avalanche terrain, going through the different parameters. I've also used this in the field at times to it really prompts people for the different things to think about when they're actually looking at avalanche terrain. And finally, I found this cartoon in the archives, the RATS system. We have Rob Buchanan here who does these funny little cartoons for us in Canada. So I had a pretty good chuckle about this, the roof avalanche. So that's basically it for some examples. I'm done now. And if anybody has some follow-up questions, I'd be happy to talk about the 8s and some of the modifications that we're doing with it.
Yeah, Grant, this is great. And I'm happy that you guys are finding the time to revise this. We've had some internal conversations here with forecasters over the last couple of days about wouldn't it be cool to put the class 0 terrain on a map for people around here. So I think that would be a pretty interesting project. You showed a bunch of examples about how this is being used in other places. How hard do you think it is to take this model and take it to other places? Someplace like Colorado that's, we're forecasting for 72,000 square kilometers here, about 28,000 square miles. It looks like the Canadians have done a pretty good job. How difficult do you think that process is?
At the moment, the actual classification work itself is not particularly difficult, but the scale of the problem is big. So it's resource intensive. And you just talked to Avalanche Canada, who's invested an awful lot of money and time for years in building those maps. They've all had to be ground checked. So they're done. But I mean, if you look at the scale of British Columbia, for example, and then you look at how much has been mapped, it's really small. You know, there's so much more that could be done. So these like Stephen was talking earlier, these automated methods, I think, hold a lot of promise for us to be able to handle the scale well. You know, for us in the national park, we haven't done a lot of mapping, barely any. We've mostly just provided ratings. We have to go there still, and that's why we're doing this revision to get ready for that. But for us, it might be a little bit easier because we're really intimately familiar with all the terrain in our park. You know, there's some outlying areas, but it's a bit easier for us just because we have staff on the ground all the time who know the terrain. But I think it's hard for big regions like you're describing when you don't know it.
Right, and in the park, you've ground truthed all this. You know, you guys run SAR missions. You spend a lot of time there climbing and doing other things. So, you know, it makes that easier. Where in some place like Colorado, you know, we might never go to some of these places. So that's pretty interesting, and it'll be an interesting step in that direction, probably with some of the GIS work that's going on. It looks like we have a live question again from Carl Birkeland. Carl, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Hey, Grant, great stuff. Hey, my question is, you know, you have this sort of class 0 where you want people to be able to go, snowshoers or whatnot, never worry about avalanches. And I'm wondering, within that class 0, how do you manage for very small terrain features? Like, I'm thinking of terrain that I would basically call class 0, but there'll be like a stream bank in it, or a little short steep slope here or there, but hardly anywhere, and maybe away from trails and stuff. Do you assess for these like small things where someone isn't likely to get in trouble, but could potentially get in trouble?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's the reason why when we first put this scale out, we didn't have a class 0, was concern for that sort of thing. And I think the concern still exists. I mentioned in the video, class 0, we consider it to be an optional rating. So if you have doubts of any kind, then I would call it class 1. And, you know, I did a bunch of mapping this spring just to get myself more familiar with trying to use class 0. And it was hard, I'll tell you. It really did change my perspective actually doing it. For the reasons you're talking about. I think you need to be 100% confident. So I can see small areas of class 0 that have been ground truthed and you're really familiar with it, but for a widespread application, I think it would be difficult because you're just not going to have the confidence for little creek banks and like what you're talking about there, which really does then fit into the definition of class 1. So we made it optional, and I think it'll be applied to really specific situations rather than a widespread use, unless it's, you know, really obvious. I think you have to be 100% confident if you're going to call it class 0.
Okay, thanks.
Eames, do you have any comments on that? You've done a lot of LiDAR and snow mapping. I guess my question for you would be, how often do you think those snow features change in a significant enough way that it would change the 8s?
The snow features or the snow topography in effect.
Yeah, throughout the winter.
I mean, I certainly would trust Grant's opinion on that, but I think the main thing is that you want to err on the conservative side with this, and if it's something where it's kind of marginal, but some sort of snowpack development over the winter would push you into a different category, then it probably should be marked as that upper category, I would imagine. And kind of similar to like Grant was just saying with the 0 to 1 designation, if there's any doubt whatsoever, you know, you got to err on the side of caution. I'm pretty curious, Grant, how sensitive this model is to the ability to map forest density. There's certainly wide areas that are classed in multiple, or in the spectrum of categories that are well forested. How does that factor into the 8s mapping process?
Avalanche Canada has a filter that they use to pick out the forest density, and I think I referred it. You'll see Cam Campbell produced a zoning model in about 2012, and that forms the basis for that. You know, I don't do a lot of the GIS mapping myself, so I'm not the best guy to actually speak on that. But my understanding of it is that's one of the great challenges, is trying to get the right kind of data so that we can actually run that filter and get good resolution on forest density. And I think at this point, depending on the place, can still be quite challenging.
Thanks.
Looks like we have a live question from Scotty Savage. Scott, can somebody unmute Scott?
Thanks, Coop. Hey, Grant, can you hear me?
I can. Hi.
Hi, Grant. Hey, thanks for all the work you're doing on this. I think some really valuable improvements to the 8 scale.
Thanks.
My question, so when I was watching your the 20-minute presentation, the extreme, I think that really makes a lot of sense, and it's you know, similar to the North American Avalanche Danger Scale being pegged at the top end of that. It was throwing me for a loop a little bit, seeing that color being represented as red, and then the step below it being represented as black. I'm wondering if you're concerned that other folks are going to be kind of confused with that, with a similar avalanche-related 5-step scale, but having the colors for the top 2 levels flip-flopped, or is that just me being an old guy getting confused?
Well, it probably is a bit of the latter as well, but I would say I agree with you, and we've had lots of discussion about that, and this is draft, and we are going to have some color change before we get to the final end of this thing here. It's kind of one of the, I would say, sticking points we haven't ended on yet. If you look, you'll see that black is used widely in Canada for complex terrain, and red seems to have been used often in the European countries. So that is a conflict which we have to resolve still. The Norwegians have suggested a completely different color scheme, you know, completely different from the danger scale. And we've had some graphics specialists and some of the research on color and the way, especially people who are colorblind, can take this in. So I think your question is good. I don't have an answer for you as to what those colors will be, but I think the conflict could be real, and we'd like to see if there's a way around it. Just a little history. I mean, in the beginning, it all started out pretty simply. We just tried to model the colors after ski runs, green, blue, black. That's how it started, but you know, it's not so simple anymore. But so yeah, good question, and I think we'll see that change before this revision is finished.
Great, Grant. Sean has a question about incorporating the 8s into works with Parks Canada employees and how that process went. And yeah, would you guys change anything? Does it seem to work pretty well?
Just sorry to clarify, how did we incorporate it into our workplace safety? Was that the question?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, well, just a quick history. I think it was 2008, WorkSafe British Columbia regulated the whole avalanche industry up here. So that was a major thing for everybody. We all had to build requirements and get risk assessments done, and it's now the law. Everybody has to have a plan and have to have risk assessments done for their workplace. And so 8s really filled a void there because it was necessary. In order to do a risk assessment, you got to be talking about the kind of terrain you're going to access. So it's proved to be really useful because lots of people don't even work in avalanche terrain, which will be another good example of why Class 0 is going to help us, because lots of people aren't even in avalanche terrain. And so we can just say that's Class 0 over there by the highway. We don't have to worry about it. In the beginning, you know, like any new thing, it was tough. Lots of people who might not have had those qualifications, but, you know, they did when they were younger, you know, frustrating. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was easy, that's for sure. But it's behind us now. It's been, you know, 12 years since that's been implemented, and it fits well now. It's easy. It's well accepted. You know, trying to make the data accessible for people. We have quite a database of trips that are also rated that aren't public trips. You know, we've got wildlife transects all through our park, for example, that the biologists use. We keep an inventory of all those ratings, and we run training every year on how the whole system works. So I would say it works really well now, but it took a while to get there.
Great. So Grant, the next question is kind of a little bit about the change to the 5-part scale. So there's been some recent criticism with the danger scale about having a 5-part scale. Do you think changing, increasing and adding those 2 layers is going to be that helpful when we look at the danger scale and we say, hey, maybe we should have fewer?
Yeah, I think that's quite a good question. And to be honest with you, I hadn't really thought about it like that, but I think it's a good question. There is a difference. I mean, the danger scale is a dynamic system where you're standing in one point, for example, and it changes every day. So people have to learn to interpret the danger scale according to the conditions. So that changes all the time. Whereas this doesn't change. You get an 8's rating, and once you've got it and it's correct, it's done. So my feeling there is that it's a bit easier for people to interpret it because it's not changing all the time. Also, the middle ground is the tough area. You know, you could expand or contract on the middle, I suppose, and I don't think that's an unreasonable question. You know, we didn't look at that during this revision. We knew we needed Class 0, and many areas already have Class 0. So we needed to add that, and then on the top end, we knew we needed to add Class 4. So I would say we didn't look at your question in terms of wondering about the middle, and it's a good question, but I think it's different than the danger scale because it's static ratings here.
Yeah, and I think also if, you know, the criticism has been maybe we don't need extreme in the danger scale, and if you removed extreme from the danger scale, you know, high would just cover a bigger area and it's still high. So I think you're right, it is a different thing. We have one more question from Carl. Carl, you can unmute yourself again, and after Carl, we'll wrap it up.
Grant, just one more quick question, and that is, you know, I noticed during your video that, you know, when you compared the automated AITS mapping and then you put the human element into it and worked with the automated map, that, you know, the patterns were largely the same, but there were a lot of small details that changed. And so I'm wondering what your feeling is about sort of some of this more large scale automated AITS mapping without that human element being integrated into it.
Good question, Carl. I say, first of all, I like the idea of the automated large scale. And we talked a few minutes ago about trying to map Colorado, for example. Like, it's just not going to happen if you have to do it human step by step. But I am concerned about the exposure element of it. And I mentioned that in the video, I think. But, you know, exposure is a key piece of the exposure scale. And so some of the parameters in there, like exposure time, or route options and interaction with avalanche paths, for example, those are pretty key. And when I'm, you know, rating terrain, you know, it really makes a difference. Like route options, for example, in complex terrain, there aren't any other options. You're committed. Whereas in challenging terrain, you know, you could be committed, but you have options to get around it. For example, those are, in my mind, key parameters. And so I think that adding exposure is critical, and I'm not sure how we're going to get there with automated AITS mapping. At this point, I'm thinking they're a great first filter, but to truly make it an exposure map, somehow you have to incorporate the exposure, and that's a challenge that is ahead. One of the reasons I'm a big fan of Stephen's work earlier, the Swiss maps, I like their terrain hazard maps, and I think of hazard as being independent of exposure. So I think that for me, if I was producing an AITS rating for an area I was unfamiliar with, having a Swiss terrain hazard map in front of me first would be just a great way to start. And I would really get a layout of the terrain, and then I could build into it, trying to add exposure routes, what the options are, and trying to learn the terrain. So there's some challenges there, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, Grant, that's great. And while this whole thing was going on, there was a text message chain from the Colorado Mountain School, and they're apparently using it within their area that they're ski guiding to map the terrain as well. So it is being used by operations and other places down here. So great talk, Grant, and we really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing how this all pans out in the next couple of months.
Great. Thanks very much, you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Grant.
Teams.
Awesome as always. Yeah, super interesting, and really like seeing the how that relates to Stephen's talk earlier. It's a great compatible couple of talks there. We'll move on to more of a technical approach here. Next up, we have Zach Miller. He's with the USGS Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, and also is a graduate student at Montana State University in Earth Sciences in the GeoSwirl group, and he's a physical science technician at the USGS. He's been a longtime snow recreator and ski patroller, avalanche instructor, forecaster, and snow research over his career. Currently lives in Bozeman, and I have it on pretty good authority that he just passed his comprehensive exams yesterday. So congrats, Zach. Go ahead and fire it up there, Zach, and let's check out your overview.
All right. Thanks for having me today, guys. Really quick, we'll just share the screen. There we go. Everyone can see that. So I'm here today to talk about telling the deep slab story of a deep slab avalanche based on weekly high resolution accumulation measurements from a drone or an unmanned aerial system. And so first and foremost, again, let's see, click there. There we go. Was hoping to acknowledge those that have helped me out. My advisory committee, which Jeff, you are a part of as well, and the immense amount of field help and supporters that I've had, both with individuals and the Bridger Bowl Ski Patrol and U.S. Forest Service Custer Gallatin National Forest. So in a brief presentation, why UAS and SAFM photogrammetry work really well for measuring snow depth is that it's safe. We're able to fly drones from a further distance than we would if we were standing or having to collect data right in the avalanche terrain and slopes. It's much faster for than digging or probing for collecting spatially continuous data across a large area. Similarly, it's fairly easy to learn with the advent of UAS technology. It's getting much, much quicker and more efficient to learn these different skills and techniques, and it presents high resolution solutions for estimating snow depth. The basics of photogrammetry are basically we take overlapping imagery collected from the drone, we tie that to key points and known locations, kind of looks like this. These key points from overlapping imagery are tied together as tie points, and those will lead to creating big point clouds that can eventually lead to 3D models of surfaces. And now we're going to apply that. And what my research kind of focused on was we collected a series of time steps throughout the season last year up in the Bridger Range, just north of Bridger Bowl. We collected approximately 20 different days of data, and this one particular day stands out as a really unique opportunity to describe kind of the benefits of using this technology in this complex terrain. And so conveniently, I got really lucky, and there was a natural deep slab avalanche on February 26th in the Hourglass Couloir where we were doing the research. So as you can see from both the aerial imagery taken on the left and the digital surface models on the right from two different dates, one before the avalanche and one the day after, you can see a pretty significant and obvious markings or obvious designation of where that avalanche is in that digital surface model. Additionally, when we flew in and then eventually modeled the data, you can see a comparison between a crown profile that we took right there in the avalanche crown safely on belay the next day. Aligns really, really well with what we modeled in the data itself. If you look really closely here, oh, let's go back on that one. Oh, that's not what we want either. Sorry about that. So if you look very closely, we can see that we have about a meter slab that broke initially as that initial failure plane. And then down below that, we have an additional 55 centimeters. The drone really mapped that incredibly well, and it was exciting to see these results. And that is kind of where I'm going to head off for questioning. Cool.
Great, Zach, and thanks for the video. Can you guys hear me okay? Apparently my last microphone wasn't working very well.
I'm good.
Great. So yeah, Zach, you know, sometimes when you're doing research, it's really good to be lucky, right? So if you wouldn't have had this event, you know, what would you have done then? Would anything have changed?
Yeah, so I think this event is a really exciting and unique opportunity to see these different processes and to be able to map at that high resolution and show its potential. But the bigger questions we're hoping to answer with this research are more looking at spatial and temporal variability of snow accumulation across that slope scale. And so although this is a really unique and exciting event, I think what's going to be really interesting is looking at those time steps in that, you know, sub-weekly basis as we move through the entire season and seeing if one big storm and its accumulation pattern kind of laid a foundation for the rest of the season, or if each incremental storm really had its own unique take and spatial distribution within that couloir itself.
And have you tried to compare any of the work that you've done with UAS to some of the stuff that's being done with LiDAR and some of the work that Deems has done in the past?
Yeah, so there is a whole bunch of research that has been done in a variety of other places that compare UAS and LiDAR data. I was really hoping to tie into some LiDAR data this spring, but it unfortunately just didn't work out. Some colleagues in the cold lab here at MSU are using LiDAR data, doing some exciting research, looking at what they can really pull out of that data. And I was hoping to do a parallel study with them, but that's just the way it is for now.
And what were you using for ground control points? Were they set on poles, or were you using trees? And how many ground control points do you need to use to get good accuracy out of the UAS?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Something we're continuing to still explore. We had a UAV or UAS that had high resolution geolocation information, or RTK, real-time kinematic GNSS technology. So it was very, very spatially aware of where it was in space and time. And generally it is, right now, it was telling us that it was accurate to within about 4 or 5 centimeters. So it knew where it was. And just for the rest of the public that are understanding this, having really accurate photo positions really allows you to create a much more precise model when you actually build the model on the other end, for that triangulation phase of the modeling. But considering ground control points, we used a variety of them. We have probably 10 or so that are mapped in the upper part of the couloir, and then we have a few down below. The hard part is having good quality ground control in the middle part of the couloir that exists all throughout the winter season. So it still is kind of up for debate as to how many you need. Some RTK devices got away with 2 or 3. We're trying to use a bit more than that.
Yeah, and it's hard to go up there every time in the winter and put a new ground control point in right before you fly. It kind of defeats the purpose and doesn't allow you to work very easily in avalanche terrain. So
absolutely, and we tried to use things that would stay visible all throughout the winter, rather than trying to have to set those points because it wasn't safe or feasible for us to be able to get up there every time.
Great. It looks like we have a live question from Sean. Aaron, can you unmute Sean, please?
Hi, Zach. This is Sean from the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute. Thanks for your presentation. It was great. I have been flying an RTK drone in a similar application recently, and what we find is, when we're off network, we don't have access to 4G, we have to use a base station. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you had to use the same thing, and if so, how did you use a base station, or did you ever try using PPK post-processing?
Great question, Sean. It's exciting that you guys are doing it as well. Please reach out to me afterwards and we can hopefully continue this conversation. But so the UAS system we use, an RTK system, was a DJI Phantom 4 RTK. And so it did come with a DJI base station as well. And we did use that each time we were out. But the results from just that are not as promising as we had hoped. Again, it's kind of a black box technology, the DJI equipment. And so what I'm looking at doing right now is diving into more of that PPK processing, which should hopefully improve our accuracy. Because again, like you mentioned, in the mountain environment, getting enough satellites to get good quality location information and not having 4G is a big challenge. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we've also had some problems with the mission planning software out of the box that comes from DJI. So yeah, let's continue this discussion later. I think we have some good things we could share.
Absolutely. That'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks.
Zach, did you see any difference between flying the drone down low where it's probably a little less windy and flying it up towards the ridge line? Did that change any of the mapping and the accuracy?
Yeah, that's also a great question, Mike. Absolutely. Of course, when I presented the project to Bridger Bowl Ski Patrol to get their approval, they're like, what are the limits of flying that thing? And I said, about 20 miles an hour wind. They're like, good luck ever flying, because the Bridgers are cranking all the time. And certainly our little drone, Stacy, got blown around quite a bit during the winter. And you can definitely see increased uncertainty in the location information up near the top of the couloir on windy days. When we'd break that ridge line and really start to get bigger winds, it would get pushed around pretty quickly.
And so did you have to use multiple batteries, I guess, to fly? How many batteries were you having to use to get one flight in?
Yeah, so we ended up doing 2 different flights. We would do an up and down slope mission, moving vertically, and then we would also do a cross slope mission where it zigzagged back down. Each one, after quite a bit of calibration and work trying to fine tune it to be the most efficient we could, was about a whole battery length. If it was an exceptionally windy day, we might have to use 2 to knock out one of the missions, but we tried to avoid that and only fly in relatively safe conditions. Being that we were on Forest Service land, we didn't want to interfere or crash this drone.
Nice. That's not too bad, actually.
Yeah.
What do you think the biggest hurdles to taking this technology into operational use, either for departments of transportation or forecasting operations or even ski patrols?
Totally. I think, each individual use has its own challenges that are faced. I think for making quick and efficient measurements of snow depth and snow depth change, you could really look at specifically in the start zones, whether you're a DOT group or a ski patrol, and that'd minimize the processing time, minimize the collection time, and you could just get up there quick and then come back down and either process it out really quick to get that specific measurement or do it as a more visual and quick and dirty format where you can fly up and see how widespread an avalanche cycle is across a mountain range or across a couple of drainages. And you could fly in, get some imagery, and hopefully tie those together to get a quick idea of, how deep a crown is, and therefore pull that back out and say, oh, well, we know because of the stratigraphy that they should be this much slab on top, and we have a loose idea of how big that is, or what layer is active during a given cycle. Challenges to be aware of, though, too, are absolutely weather, that drones are limited in where they can fly and how much. I know that flying through some cloudier weather with inclement precipitation, we certainly had rhyming on the blades, which can crash them pretty quickly. So it's something to be aware of.
James, did you burn up all your good questions yesterday, or do you have anything good?
Zach looks pretty fresh. I think he can handle it. Kind of akin to the accuracy up in the wind question. Obviously you've got a pretty big elevation gradient or relief in your flight area there as well. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the higher resolution you get being closer to the terrain up near the ridge partly compensates for a little lower accuracy up in the wind? Or in other words, do you feel like the accuracy across the whole domain is pretty consistent, or is there a variability there as well?
Yeah, we aimed to have it be consistent by flying terrain corrected flight paths. So the drone did follow at approximately 50 meters above ground level for the entire flight on each of our flights. And so when it would encounter the big cliff that you can kind of see in the southern kind of southeast corner of the couloir itself, it had to climb up and over that. But when you were looking at the actual snow surface, it was held pretty statically at about 50 meters. And that was based on an earlier lower resolution flight, but we took that base model and then flew every flight and mission on that base model. So hopefully it's more of just the positioning accuracy with the drone being blown around, but really those windy days were few and far between because we tried not to fly when it was that bad.
Well, to me, it makes it even more impressive. You're able to do a full flight on one battery, given that it's climbing the whole distance every other flight line. Like that's pretty impressive battery life on that thing. That's great.
Yeah.
And Zach, what about flying at altitude? You think you'll have any issues there being higher than the Bridger Ridgeline?
Probably, yeah. I could imagine that in the Colorado type sense, both you guys have a lot of wind, and flying with that, thinner air or less dense air could be a possible issue, and you might end up burning through more batteries. Conveniently, it didn't seem like cold weather seemed to affect it very much. We flew in temperatures down and around 0 degrees Fahrenheit and didn't seem to really hurt the batteries at all. But we were extra cognizant of pulling it back really early whenever we were flying in cold conditions.
Gotcha. We have a question from Matt Tarkington. He's also using the P4 RTK, and he's having trouble with, I think it's the snow being blown out, so kind of the white part of that, as well as shadows being too dark. And his model is ending up quite noisy, he says. How are you able to overcome that noise?
That's an excellent question as well. And I think that that's certainly, as discussed in comps yesterday with Jeff and others, the shadow line and the differential light through a scene and the changing light through a scene can introduce uncertainty into your models. We really aimed in general, though, to try to shoot at the right exposure where we got the surface snow not overexposed, because that was the big goal, is to capture that surface. And, to have such a uniform surface, you need some sort of texture to it. So picking up any sort of texture in that, especially with like wind effect or anything like that, was really helpful. So for us, we generally tended to underexpose if needed, just to try to compensate for not blowing out photos.
How did you, so I take it you flew snow off in the summertime.
Mm-hmm.
How did your structure from motion models compare to DEMs from the USGS, or are there high resolution DEMs for that area?
So unfortunately, the highest resolution DEM I could get from the USGS is about a 10-meter resolution, which is what we flew our first flight to make a base map of, that then we flew the rest of the flights based on that map. And so again, it's all about kind of the variability seen within each pixel. And at 10-meter resolution, you're kind of missing a lot of the key features of that upper couloir. The general runout and trend and shape of the slope is just fine, but the intricacies of that cliff and that kind of upper bowl structure are missed. And again, this is just applying specifically to the slope scale. So I think that's really a key component of where these UAS can come into play, is they fit perfectly in that slope scale, but looking at bigger picture, they might not have the battery or the strength or capability to fly bigger.
It'd be pretty interesting to compare the structure from motion to some place where we have really good LiDAR data and can look on that scale and see how those two match up, hopefully really well. And that would be really useful.
And there have been some studies like that actually done in Europe. I can't think of the names off the top of my head right now, but I can promise you there have been a variety of those where they've compared UAS and LiDAR acquired data. And especially I would say that airborne LiDAR data is really, really relevant in the comparison, just because in the terrestrial sense, you can often be blocked by trees, vegetation, or for reference in my scene, that big cliff face, which is 250 feet tall, you wouldn't see the upper piece.
So the last question is from Ian, and Ian's kind of wondering how you see this research moving into the future. So what do you see the benefits of being able to do this, I guess, on a larger scale or in different areas will be, so for the landscape and moving snow and the snow distribution?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I'd really like to hopefully be able to pull out and recognize differences between different storm tracks possibly and see how they affect that individual slope. I think it could be a great learning tool as well for avalanche education, because we all recognize that spatial variability is a key component in all of our day-to-day travel in the backcountry, but gaining that intuitive knowledge and understanding and recognition of it is a pretty challenging thing. And so just adding more visual cues and actually quantified data where we could say, hey, we had a westerly storm. Where do you think the snow ended up in this picture? And then to have it like actually checked and proven that actually the snow ended up right here and this is why, could I think be a really, really cool piece of technology there.
Excellent. Okay, well, we're out of time. You guys can catch Zach on the chat. And Zach, I'm really glad you finished your comps and everything's good. And look forward to the future of your research. Pass it over to you, Deems.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Zach. Great contribution to this session. And for our final talk in this session, we'd like to welcome Dr. Regula Fraunfelder. She's a principal engineer and senior researcher at NGI, the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute in Oslo. She has an advanced degree in physical geography with studies in mathematics, geology, and glaciology, and a doctorate in natural sciences. She specialized in remote sensing and geoinformatics over her career, with a special focus on natural hazards, climate change, and urban subsidence. She's got over 15 years of experience as project manager for both research and development projects, as well as consultancy. And she has received numerous academic distinctions over her career. She's also an enthusiastic kayaker and country skier during the winter, and a randonnée guide with the Swiss Alpine Club. And we're excited to hear Dr. Fraunfelder discuss measuring and monitoring avalanche activity from space.
Thank you. Now, I don't know if you can see my screen because I can't see it anymore.
We can see it.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, I'll just try to then click through without seeing it. That's going to be a bit challenging, but anyway, welcome to everyone and thanks very much for having me here. It's great, and I would like to thank all the organizers that have put a tremendous amount of work in making this work. It's really great.
Hey, so, Regula, yeah. I don't want to interrupt you, but you're not in presenter mode. You're just on your slides, so maybe if you can.
That's a very good idea. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, as Jeff introduced me, it's I had a talk about avalanche information from space. And the motivation was really that we want to identify, map, and use information from space that's relevant for avalanche warning and avalanche modeling. In my talk, I briefly touched how such information can be used before avalanches have released, but the main part was really how we can use the data and the information after avalanches have released. You see here an optical imagery that's been taken from 400 kilometers above the ground. And I think you agree that it's really an incredible amount of details that you can detect in this in such imagery. And so the challenge is really that a human observer, all you guys, you have a lot of experience in backcountry areas and with avalanches. For you, it's not a problem at all to discern these avalanches on this picture here to the left. You see the rock slopes where the avalanches have released, you see the actual deposits, you can see the undisturbed snow. But the challenge is then really how to make an algorithm, a computer, to realize and capture the same. And in the next image, you just see kind of how we calculated, computed such algorithms that are able to capture more or less what a human observer sees. Here you have the snow avalanches in green, the rock outcrops in red. There are some glare areas, and then they also have some more or less unaffected snow surfaces. In my talk, I showed several examples on how we applied that in different areas, and here I just show you one example from the Tatra Mountains in Slovakia, where we detected several hundred avalanches automatically by using this algorithm after a large avalanche release that they had in 2009. One of the problems with optical imagery is, of course, that it's very sensitive to the illumination situation. So you can't use it when it's bad weather. You can't use it during night. And especially the bad weather factor is, of course, it's a bit of a bummer when you talk about avalanches. So we also started to look together with other groups into the potential use of SAR imagery, so radar imagery. Here you see a SAR backscatter image draped over an area in northern Norway. It looks like a hillshade, but if I show you the next one from some days afterwards, you start to see these white clusters. And if you make a change detection between this image and the next one, you can start to discern these avalanche deposits that pop out in green colors and differentiate it, for example, from the areas where there is no change or where you have just undisturbed snow. And then you can again use that to automatically detect these avalanche deposits and extract them from your data and feed them into a database. So yeah, we think that this type of data is really of great use for avalanche forecasting services. We think that optical imagery is mostly applicable to update avalanche databases. For example, after large avalanche cycles, and when you have the time to kind of wait for the next good weather situation and then capture imageries and use such algorithms afterwards to feed your databases. Whereas the radar data, because it's insensitive to light, so you can use it both during bad weather and during the polar night, it has a more near real-time application focus. So you can actually use it much more real-time when in your forecasting procedures, when you see that an event, a big cycle might be onsetting. There's one thing that I also would like to mention, and I also elaborated a little bit on this during my talk, that due to the mere size of these data, for example, the SAR data covers 200 by 250 kilometers, just one scene, and there are several terabytes if you have a stack of data. I think that it's most suited for bigger institutions, such as regional national avalanche forecasting service and authorities that really have the resources to make the operational use of this type of data. And this was my short introduction.
Thank you so much. As you said in your summary, I think this is really useful information for avalanche forecasting operations, special operations, like the one we run here in Colorado, where we're covering very large areas. Two quick questions for you while we let the participants ask some questions. While you're using the digital globe data, that's quite expensive data. Is there anything else you think you can use, or anything else you've tried that would cut the cost of some of the imagery?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we started with this type of data because at the time we started with this work, it's really the only available alternatives were kind of in the free realm was Landsat data. And we also tried it on Landsat data, but we were not extremely happy with the results. So we were really hoping for the new Sentinel-2 data from the European Commission, and we've also tried it there. The problem is really it's a sample size of 10 by 10 pixel, 10 by 10 meters per pixel. So your avalanches have to be pretty large before you can start detecting it. So currently, unfortunately, I would say for the optical stuff, the freely available data is not really an option if you want to be able to detect more than D4 or maybe D3 avalanches.
Gotcha. And so the other thing is the revisit time. The further north you are, the faster the satellites revisit the area. You know, we looked at doing some of this down here, and our revisit times were 3, 4, maybe sometimes even 5 days. And so when you're using something like this in an operational setting, that might be too long of a time. Do you see any of that as issues? Is it better being further north at higher latitudes?
Yeah, definitely. You definitely have a point there. So, I mean, up in the high north, for example, of course, obviously we tested it mostly in Norway, and we also had a test case in Alaska. There we're currently up to 8 imageries, like SAR imageries over 6 days. So you have a daily image. Already in southern Norway, we're down to 4 pictures in 3 consecutive days, but then maybe you might have like a hole for 2 to 3 days, and that of course really is a drawback for the operational use. But I think it still has quite a big potential if you kind of want to track cycles in a non-real-time, non-forecaster setting, but kind of really want to track your cycles in order to validate the warnings you're issued or the models you're using, because the number of avalanches that you can track with these type of data is just so much higher than if you have people that have to go out into the field. And also it's a safety issue. Yeah,
that's definitely true. We have a live question from Basti. Bastian, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Regular, for the talk. I think that has really an operational use. My question is a little bit technical because the mapped avalanches you showed, they always from an inclined perspective, and in my thoughts, I always thought the satellite is looking at the Earth rectangular. And is that just to show it better to us, or does the inclination of the perspective from the satellite has any influence on the detection, or is it? Can you say something on that?
Yeah. So for example, the SAR satellite comes with quite a steep incline, so it's about 23 degrees line of sight angle. So it's really actually looking kind of from the right. Yeah, it's kind of looking like this way down to the Earth, and that has an implication on in which slopes you will be able to detect the avalanches best. So for example, if you have avalanches or slopes that are 100% north facing or 100% south facing, depending on topography, you might not be able to detect all of them. But it really also depends on the topography, how steep it is, if you kind of get what we call radar shadow or too big distortions. Yeah, so that has an influence. And for the optical imagery, it's a bit less pronounced because they tend to look in a steeper angle down to the Earth. So they're not looking down like totally straight down, but they have a less flat angle than the radar satellites. But also there you can you run into shadow issues, of course, depending on how your mountain range is oriented.
Okay, thanks. So and the angle doesn't change, right? So you miss always the same expositions.
For the radar satellite, that's true. But then there you kind of have the what we call ascending and descending orbit. So it kind of the satellite takes a picture when it kind of rotates in both ways through, around the Earth. So you can partly compensate for that. With the optical imagery, kind of the one that we talk now about, kind of the one that you buy, there are different providers that offer data from different angles. And actually, if you order data, which we did sometimes because we kind of were expecting an avalanche cycle, then you can, for some providers, you can even kind of determine what angle they shall use, because they kind of really program their satellites.
Wow.
To a certain degree, of course. I mean,
yeah. Hey, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
We also have a live question from Carl. Carl, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Hi, Regula. Thanks for the interesting talk. Hey, the question I have is, I'm wondering, were you able to characterize sort of a large or widespread avalanche cycle with your technique? Have you sort of lucked out and gotten a real large avalanche cycle and been able to characterize the number of avalanches with this technique?
Well, it depends a little bit what you mean with characterizing. I mean, what we did is this example that I showed from the Tetra Mountains, but that was really kind of a hindcasting effort. So kind of they approached us and said, well, listen, guys, we have kind of had this big cycle in 2009. We bought the imagery. Can you help us to kind of map all these avalanches in order to get an idea, in which slopes did they release? And they knew all kind of, they had all the information about the weather situation that led to this cycle and stuff like that. For the work that we did with the Alaskan Department of Transportation, it was a bit similar, but there's, I mean, I wouldn't call that work a cycle. There we really were just kind of were tracking their glide avalanche problem during a spring season. So I'm not entirely sure what you mean kind of with characterizing the cycle. So maybe you have to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're trying to do is look at this big avalanche cycle that happened in Colorado and understand how many avalanches we had over that time period for a certain area. So maybe that work that you did in 2009, do you recall off the top of your head how many avalanches you counted in that zone over in that avalanche cycle?
Not exactly, but I know it was something between 300 and 400.
Okay, cool, thanks.
You're welcome, thanks for the question.
It's a difference, Carl, when you're buying the data and when you have to beg people for the data.
Yeah.
We have a live question again from Ron Simenhois. Ron, you can unmute yourself and talk.
Hey, Regula, thanks for your talk. Just, do you have any idea what's the ratio in between number of avalanche that's been reported by the public and what you can see from satellite imagery, or real number of avalanches?
Yeah, personally, I'm not sitting on this information from an own study, but in preparation for the talk, I got some information from our colleagues at the Norwegian Water and Energy Department, and they did this type of study in one of their warning regions in northern Norway a couple of years back, and they had manually detected. I mean, they did this during 2 winter seasons, and in each winter season, they got information kind of from manual observations from about 100 avalanches per season in this warning region. And when they did the same effort with the avalanche data, with the satellite data, they came to approximately 5,000 avalanches each winter for the same time period in the same area. So it's kind of like 50 times more than what was reported. And another important fact is also that the manually observed observations, they had a bias because they were observed along roads and along popular randonnée tours and near to settlements, whereas the satellite doesn't have this bias. So the satellite really virtually detected avalanches in all type of settings. So they were also able to kind of to take away this bias by using this type of data.
Thank you. Might as well keep on asking.
Sure.
Do you did you use some historical satellite imagery data to try to gauge historical big avalanche events and then try to calibrate your models as far as avalanche running distance?
Okay, could you repeat the question? Sorry, I'm not totally sure.
Do you have, did you look at the historical satellite imagery to try to gauge big avalanche cycles in the past and maybe large avalanches to try to calibrate your models for runouts?
Okay, yeah. No, we haven't done this systematically yet. We looked at kind of certain avalanches, kind of specific ones when colleagues from the avalanche warning group came over and say, hey, can you look at this one? But we haven't done this systematically yet, no. And maybe also one thing has to be said. I mean, when we talk about historical events, I mean, this data that we are now using, it's not going back further than 2014 for the SAR data. The optical data, of course, has a different historical record, but the SAR data that's now available from the European Commission, these satellites were launched in 2014 and operational in 2015.
Any more questions, Ron? Is the next part of your question, do you want to do that analysis or are you already building a satellite in your garage there, Ron? Deems, you have anything?
Regular, there seems to be some natural tie-ins between your work and the automated terrain mapping that Stephen and Grant mentioned earlier. I'm wondering if you've used any of the data you've developed to date in that capacity, either to develop or to validate the terrain exposure or terrain hazard mapping.
We haven't, but it might be that the Norwegian Water and Energy Department Directorate has done it, because they also have, as Grant mentioned, they have these KAST maps, and they're also trying to make this SAR-based avalanche detection operational now for the 22 Norwegian warning regions from this from this winter on. And so I would guess that they start to tie this together. But I haven't heard that they've done it already. But I guess that's kind of would be a natural next step for them to take.
Awesome. That's great talk. We're out of time. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to email them or put them up in the question and answers, and we'll pass them on. Deems, I'll turn it over to you for the wrap up. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And once again, a massive thanks to all of our speakers for all of their time during these wonderful talks and for their time participating in the discussion today. Always worry with these online meetings that you end up with nobody participating. So this has been a great discussion, and thanks to all the participants for all the great questions and discussion. I'd just like to say from a personal standpoint, I really enjoy these mapping questions. There's a lot of new technologies out there that are being brought to bear on avalanche science, and I think it's pretty readily evident just from the series of talks that we've seen today that we're really seeing a brave new world in terms of new data sources, new spatial data sources that are allowing us to get a handle on the avalanche hazard. Coop, I was particularly excited to hear you interrogating pointedly about specific applications in Colorado, and I'm hoping that we can develop some of these techniques here as well.
We're looking out for number one, Jeff.
That's right. Okay. Thanks again to all of our presenters and participants, and we'll see if we can rustle up Ethan here for closing up today's proceedings.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Coop, for a great session. You guys did a great job keeping the conversation going. Some super interesting questions and really interesting talks. And I think a really strong finish from Regio. I really like that example of very strong technical application that we can probably use really as soon as we can get a good data stream. I know Coop is going to be and Ron are going to be asking me for a budget item to buy data and send out orders for the satellites. So I'm really looking forward to that. Really a great day today. Thanks everybody for participating. The audience has been wonderful. I really appreciate all the questions and interaction from everybody, and really hope that that continues over the next couple of days. I'd like to thank DINAFIT and Pomoco and all the other sponsors for their help in this event, and all of the great speakers and moderators who did such a great job today. That is going to wrap us up for day one. We are going to try to get the live session today posted onto the website later this afternoon. So if you really want to watch the session over again, you'll have that opportunity. And certainly if you miss something, you can take a look. Remember that those pre-recorded talks are still available on the website for tomorrow. There's a lot of really good materials, some different topics tomorrow. We'll start again at 9 o'clock, just like we did today, and talk about avalanche forecasting and snowpack interpretation. And then the second session is on weather avalanches and avalanche cycles. So with that, we'll bid you adieu. Thanks again for participating, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon or night if you're in Europe.